Chapter 9 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 9. Lupin's Anger. He remained for one moment motionless and speechless. Above was a perfect clatter of things being pushed about, as though the besieged were building themselves a barricade. But to the right of the electric rays, diffused daylight entered through an opening that was suddenly exposed, and he saw, in front of this opening, first one form and then another stooping in order to escape over the roofs. He levelled his revolver and fired, but badly, for he was thinking of Florence and his hand trembled. 3 more shots rang out. The bullets rattled against the old scrap iron in the loft. The 5th shot was followed by a cry of pain. Don Luis once more rushed up the ladder. Slowly making his way through the tangle of farm implements and over some cases of dried rapeseed forming a regular rampart, he at last, after bruising and barking his shins, succeeded in reaching the opening, and was greatly surprised, on passing through it, to find himself on level ground. It was the top of the sloping bank against which the barn stood. He descended the slope at haphazard, to the left of the barn, and passed in front of the building, but saw nobody. He then went up again on the right, and although the flat part was very narrow, he searched it carefully, for in the growing darkness of the twilight he had every reason to fear renewed attacks from the enemy. He now became aware of something which he had not perceived before. The bank ran along the top of the wall, which at this spot was quite 16 feet high. Gaston Sauverand and Florence had, beyond a doubt, escaped this way. Perenna followed the wall, which was fairly wide, till he came to a lower part, and here he jumped into a ploughed field, skirting a little wood toward which the fugitive must have run. He started exploring it, but, realizing its denseness, he at once saw that it was a waste of time to linger in pursuit. He therefore returned to the village, while thinking over this, his latest exploit. Once again Florence and her accomplice had tried to get rid of him. Once again Florence figured prominently in this network of criminal plots. At the moment when chance informed Don Luis that old Langernault had probably died by foul play, at the moment when chance, by leading him to Hanged Man's Barn, as he christened it, brought him into the presence of 2 skeletons, Florence appeared as a murderous vision, as an evil genius who was seen wherever death had passed with its trail of blood and corpses. "Oh, the loathsome creature!" he muttered with a shudder. "How can she have so fair a face, and eyes of such haunting beauty, so grave, sincere, and almost guileless?" In the church square, outside the inn, Mazeroux, who had returned, was filling the petrol tank of the motor and lighting the lamps. Don Luis saw the Mayor of Damigny crossing the square. He took him aside. "By the way, Monsieur le Maire, did you ever hear any talk in the district, perhaps 2 years ago, of the disappearance of a couple 40 or 50 years of age? The husband's name was Alfred." "And the wife's Victorine, eh?" the mayor broke in. "I should think so. The affair created some stir. They lived at Alençon on a small private income. They disappeared between one day and the next, and no one has since discovered what became of them, any more than a little hoard, some 20,000 francs or so, which they had realized the day before by the sale of their house. I remember them well. De Dessus-la-Mare, their name was." "Thank you, Monsieur le Maire," said Perenna, who had learned all that he wanted to know. The car was ready. A minute after, he was rushing toward Alençon with Mazeroux. "Where are we going, Chief?" asked the sergeant. "To the station. I have every reason to believe, first, that Sauverand was informed this morning in what way remains to be seen of the revelations made last night by Mme. Fauville relating to old Langernault; and, secondly, that he has been prowling around and inside old Langernault's property to day for reasons that also remain to be seen. And I presume that he came by train and that he will go back by train." Perenna's supposition was confirmed without delay. He was told at the railway station that a gentleman and a lady had arrived from Paris at 2 o'clock, that they had hired a trap at the hotel next door, and that, having finished their business, they had gone back a few minutes ago, by the 7:40 express. The description of the lady and gentleman corresponded exactly with that of Florence and Sauverand. "Off we go," said Perenna, after consulting the timetable. "We are an hour behind. We may catch up with the scoundrel at Le Mans." "We'll do that, Chief, and we'll collar him, I swear. Him and his lady, since there are 2 of them." "There are 2 of them, as you say. Only what?" Don Luis waited to reply until they were seated and the engine started, when he said: "Only, my boy, you will keep your hands off the lady." "Why should I?" "Do you know who she is? Have you a warrant against her?" "No." "Then shut up." "But one word more, Alexandre, and I'll set you down beside the road. Then you can make as many arrests as you please." Mazeroux did not breathe another word. For that matter, the speed at which they at once began to go hardly left him time to raise a protest. Not a little anxious, he thought only of watching the horizon and keeping a lookout for obstacles. The trees vanished on either side almost unseen. Their foliage overhead made a rhythmical sound as of moaning waves. Night insects dashed themselves to death against the lamps. "We shall get there right enough," Mazeroux ventured to observe. "There's no need to put on the pace." The speed increased and he said no more. Villages, plains, hills, and then, suddenly, in the midst of the darkness, the lights of a large town, Le Mans. "Do you know the way to the station, Alexandre?" "Yes, Chief, to the right and then straight on." Of course, they ought to have gone to the left. They wasted 7 or 8 minutes in wandering through the streets and receiving contradictory instructions. When the motor pulled up at the station, the train was whistling. Don Luis jumped out, rushed through the waiting room, found the doors shut, jostled the railway officials who tried to stop him, and reached the platform. A train was about to start on the farther line. The last door was banged to. He ran along the carriages, holding on to the brass rails. "Your ticket, sir! Where's your ticket?" shouted an angry collector. Don Luis continued to fly along the footboards, giving a swift glance through the panes, thrusting aside the persons whose presence at the windows prevented him from seeing, prepared at any moment to burst into the compartment containing the 2 accomplices. He did not see them in the end carriages. The train started, and suddenly he gave a shout. There they were, the 2 of them, by themselves. He had seen them. They were there. Florence lying on the seat, with her head on Sauverand's shoulder, and he leaning over her, with his arms around her. Mad with rage, he flung back the bottom latch and seized the handle of the carriage door. At the same moment, he lost his balance and was pulled off by the furious ticket collector and by Mazeroux, who bellowed: "Why, you're mad, Chief! You'll kill yourself!" "Let go, you ass!" roared Don Luis. "It's they! Let me be, can't you?" The carriages filed past. He tried to jump onto another footboard. But the 2 men were clinging to him. Some railway porters came to their assistance. The station master ran up. The train moved out of the station. "Idiots!" he shouted. "Boobies! Pack of asses that you are! Couldn't you leave me alone? Oh, I swear to heaven!" With a blow of his left fist, he knocked the ticket collector down. With a blow of his right, he sent Mazeroux spinning. And, shaking off the porters and the station master, he rushed along the platform to the luggage room, where he took flying leaps over several batches of trunks, packing cases and portmanteaux. "Oh, the perfect fool!" he mumbled, on seeing that Mazeroux had let the power down in the car. "Trust him if there's any blunder going." Don Luis had driven his car at a fine rate during the day, but that night the pace became vertiginous. A very meteor flashed through the suburbs of Le Mans and hurled itself along the high road. Perenna had but one thought in his head: to reach the next station, which was Chartres, before the 2 accomplices, and to fly at Sauverand's throat. He saw nothing but that: the savage grip of his 2 hands that would set Florence Levasseur's lover gasping in his agony. Her lover, he muttered, gnashing his teeth. "Why, of course, that explains everything. They have combined against their accomplice, Marie Fauville. And it is she alone, poor devil, who will pay for the horrible series of crimes. Is she their accomplice, even?" he wondered. Who knows if that pair of demons are not capable, after killing Hippolyte and his son, of having plotted the ruin of Marie Fauville, the last obstacle that stood between them and the Mornington inheritance? Doesn't everything point to that conclusion? Didn't I find the list of dates in a book belonging to Florence? Don't the facts prove that the letters were communicated by Florence? Those letters accuse Gaston Sauverand as well. But how does that affect things? He no longer loves Marie, but Florence. And Florence loves him. She is his accomplice, his counsellor, the woman who will live by his side and benefit by his fortune. True, she sometimes pretends to be defending Marie Fauville. Play acting, or perhaps remorse, fright at the thought of all that she has done against her rival, and of the fate that awaits the unhappy woman. But she is in love with Sauverand, and she continues to carry on the struggle without pity and without respite. And that is why she wanted to kill me, the interloper whose insight she dreaded. And she hates me and loathes me. To the hum of the engine and the sighing of the trees, which bent down at the approach, he murmured incoherent words. The recollection of the 2 lovers clasped in each other's arms made him cry aloud with jealousy. He wanted to be revenged. For the first time in his life, the longing, the feverish craving to kill set his brain boiling. "Hang it all!" he growled suddenly. "The engine's misfiring. Mazeroux!" Mazeroux!" "What, Chief? Did you know that I was here?" exclaimed Mazeroux, emerging from the shadow in which he sat hidden. "You jackass! Do you think that the first idiot who comes along can hang on to the footboard of my car without my knowing it? You must be feeling comfortable down there. I'm suffering agonies and I'm shivering with cold. That's right, it'll teach you. Tell me, where did you buy your petrol?" "At the grocer's." "At a thief's, you mean. It's muck. The plugs are getting sooted up." "Are you sure?" "Can't you hear the misfiring, you fool?" The motor, indeed, at moments seemed to hesitate. Then everything became normal again. Don Luis forced the pace. Going downhill, they appeared to be hurling themselves into space. One of the lamps went out. The other was not as bright as usual. But nothing diminished Don Luis's ardour. There was more misfiring, fresh hesitations, followed by efforts, as though the engine was pluckily striving to do its duty. And then suddenly came the final failure, a dead stop at the side of the road, a stupid breakdown. "Confound it!" roared Don Luis. "We're stuck! Oh, this is the last straw!" "Come, Chief, we'll put it right, and we'll pick up Sauverand at Paris instead of Chartres, that's all." "You infernal ass! The repairs will take an hour. And then she'll break down again. It's not petrol, it's filth they've foisted on you." The country stretched around them to endless distances, with no other lights than the stars that riddled the darkness of the sky. Don Luis was stamping with fury. He would have liked to kick the motor to pieces. He would have liked... It was Mazeroux who caught it, in the hapless sergeant's own words. Don Luis took him by the shoulders, shook him, loaded him with insults and abuse and, finally, pushing him against the roadside bank and holding him there, said, in a broken voice of mingled hatred and sorrow: "It's she, do you hear, Mazeroux? It's Sauverand's companion who has done everything. I'm telling you now because I'm afraid of relenting. Yes, I am a weak coward. She has such a grave face, with the eyes of a child. But it's she, Mazeroux. She lives in my house. Remember her name, Florence Levasseur. You'll arrest her, won't you? I might not be able to. My courage fails me when I look at her. The fact is that I have never loved before. There have been other women, but no, those were fleeting fancies, not even that. I don't even remember the past. Whereas Florence... You must arrest her, Mazeroux. You must deliver me from her eyes. They burn into me like poison. If you don't deliver me, I shall kill her as I killed Dolores, or else they will kill me, or... Oh, I don't know all the ideas that are driving me wild. You see, there's another man," he explained. "There's Sauverand, whom she loves. Oh, the infamous pair! They have killed Fauville and the boy and old Langernault and those two in the barn and others besides, Cosmo Mornington, Vérot, and more still. They're monsters, she most of all. And if you saw her eyes..." He spoke so low that Mazeroux could hardly hear him. He had let go his hold of Mazeroux and seemed utterly cast down with despair, a surprising symptom in a man of his amazing vigour and authority. "Come, Chief," said the sergeant, helping him up. "This is all stuff and nonsense. Trouble with women. I've had it like everybody else. Madame Mazeroux. Yes, I got married while you were away. Madame Mazeroux turned out badly herself. Gave me the devil of a time, Madame Mazeroux did. I'll tell you all about it, Chief, how Madame Mazeroux rewarded my kindness." He led Don Luis gently to the car and settled him on the front seat. "Take a rest, Chief. It's not very cold and there are plenty of furs. The first peasant that comes along at daybreak, I'll send him to the next town for what we want. And for food, too, for I'm starving. And everything will come right. It always does with women. All you have to do is to kick them out of your life. Except when they anticipate you and kick themselves out. I was going to tell you, Madame Mazeroux..." Don Luis was never to learn what had happened with Madame Mazeroux. The most violent catastrophes had no effect upon the peacefulness of his slumbers. He was asleep almost at once. It was late in the morning when he woke up. Mazeroux had had to wait till 7 o'clock before he could hail a cyclist on his way to Chartres. They made a start at 9 o'clock. Don Luis had recovered all his coolness. He turned to his sergeant. "I said a lot last night that I did not mean to say. However, I don't regret it. Yes, it is my duty to do everything to save Mme. Fauville and to catch the real culprit. Only the task falls upon myself, and I swear that I shan't fail in it. This evening, Florence Levasseur shall sleep in the lock-up." "I'll help you, Chief," replied Mazeroux in a queer tone of voice. "I need nobody's help. If you touch a single hair of her head, I'll do for you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Chief." "Then hold your tongue." His anger was slowly returning and expressed itself in an increase of speed, which seemed to Mazeroux a revenge executed upon himself. They raced over the cobblestones of Chartres. Rambouillet, Chevreuse, and Versailles received the terrifying vision of a thunderbolt tearing across them from end to end. Saint Cloud, the Bois de Boulogne. On the Place de la Concorde, as the motor was turning toward the Tuileries, Mazeroux objected: "Aren't you going home, Chief?" "No, there's something more urgent first. We must relieve Marie Fauville of her suicidal obsession by letting her know that we have discovered the criminals." "And then?" "Then I want to see the Prefect of Police." "M. Desmalions is away and won't be back till this afternoon." "In that case, the examining magistrate." "He doesn't get to the law courts till 12, and it's only 11 now." "We'll see." Mazeroux was right. There was no one at the law courts. Don Luis lunched somewhere close by, after calling at the detective office, came to fetch him and took him to the magistrates' corridor. Don Luis's excitement, his extraordinary restlessness, did not fail to strike Mazeroux, who asked: "Are you still of the same mind, Chief?" "More than ever. I looked through the newspapers at lunch. Marie Fauville, who was sent to the infirmary after her second attempt, has again tried to kill herself by banging her head against the wall of the room. They have put a straitjacket on her, but she is refusing all food. It is my duty to save her." "How?" "By handing over the real criminal. I shall inform the magistrate in charge of the case, and this evening I shall bring you Florence Levasseur, dead or alive." "And Sauverand?" "Sauverand? That won't take long, unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless I settle his business myself, the miscreant." "Chief!" "Oh, dry up!" There were some reporters near them waiting for particulars. He recognized them and went up to them. "You can say, gentlemen, that from to day I am taking up the defence of Marie Fauville and devoting myself entirely to her cause." They all protested. Was it not he who had had Mme. Fauville arrested? Was it not he who had collected a heap of convicting proofs against her? "I shall demolish those proofs one by one," he said. "Marie Fauville is the victim of wretches who have hatched the most diabolical plot against her and whom I am about to deliver up to justice." "But the teeth, the marks of the teeth!" "A coincidence, an unparalleled coincidence, but one which now strikes me as a most powerful proof of innocence. I tell you that if Marie Fauville had been clever enough to commit all those murders, she would also have been clever enough not to leave behind her a fruit bearing the marks of her 2 rows of teeth." "But still—" "She is innocent. And that is what I am going to tell the examining magistrate. She must be informed of the efforts that are being made in her favour. She must be given hope at once. If not, the poor thing will kill herself and her death will be on the conscience of all who accused an innocent woman. She must—" At that moment he interrupted himself. His eyes were fixed on one of the journalists who was standing a little way off, listening to him and taking notes. He whispered to Mazeroux: "Could you manage to find out that beggar's name? I can't remember where on earth I've seen him before." But an usher now opened the door of the examining magistrate, who, on receiving Don Perenna's card, had asked to see him at once. He stepped forward and was about to enter the room with Mazeroux, when he suddenly turned to his companion with a cry of rage:
"It's he! It was Sauverand in disguise! Stop him! He's made off! Run, can't you?"
He himself darted away, followed by Mazeroux and a number of warders and journalists. He soon outdistanced them, so that 3 minutes later he heard no one more behind him. He had rushed down the stair of the Mousetrap and through the subway leading from one courtyard to the other. Here 2 people told him that they had met a man walking at a smart pace. The track was a false one. He became aware of this, hunted about, lost a good deal of time, and managed to discover that Sauverand had left by the Boulevard du Palais and joined a very pretty, fair haired woman, Florence Levasseur, obviously, on the Quai de l'Horloge. They had both got into the motor bus that runs from the Place Saint Michel to the Gare Saint-Lazare. Don Luis went back to a lonely little street where he had left his car in the charge of a boy. He set the engine going and drove at full speed to the Gare Saint-Lazare. From the omnibus shelter he went off on a fresh track which also proved to be wrong, lost quite another hour, returned to the terminus, and ended by learning for certain that Florence had stepped by herself into a motor bus which would take her toward the Place du Palais Bourbon. Contrary to all his expectations, therefore, the girl must have gone home. The thought of seeing her again roused his anger to its highest pitch. All the way down the Rue Royale and across the Place de la Concorde he kept blurting out words of revenge and threats which he was itching to carry out. He would abuse Florence. He would sting her with his insults. He felt a bitter and painful need to hurt the odious creature. But on reaching the Place du Palais Bourbon he pulled up short. His practised eye had counted at a glance, on the right and left, a half dozen men whose professional look there was no mistaking; and Mazeroux, who had caught sight of him, had spun round on his heel and was hiding under a gateway. He called him: "Mazeroux!" The sergeant appeared greatly surprised to hear his name and came up to the car. "Hullo, the Chief!" His face expressed such embarrassment that Don Luis felt his fears taking definite shape. "Look here, is it for me that you and your men are hanging about outside my house?" "There's a notion, Chief," replied Mazeroux, looking very uncomfortable. "You know that you're in favour, all right." Don Luis gave a start. He understood. Mazeroux had betrayed his confidence. To obey his scruples of conscience, as well as to rescue the chief from the dangers of a fatal passion, Mazeroux had denounced Florence Levasseur. Perenna clenched his fists in an effort of his whole being to stifle his boiling rage. It was a terrible blow. He received a sudden intuition of all the blunders which his mad jealousy had made him commit since the day before, and a presentiment of the irreparable disasters that might result from them. The conduct of events was slipping from him. "Have you the warrant?" he asked. Mazeroux spluttered. "It was quite by accident. I met the Prefect, who was back. We spoke of the young lady's business, and, as it happened, they had discovered that the photograph, the photograph of Florence Levasseur, which the Prefect lent you, well, they have discovered that you faked it. And then when I mentioned the name of Florence, the Prefect remembered that that was the name." "Have you the warrant?" Don Luis repeated in a harsher tone. "Well, you see, I couldn't help it. M. Desmalions, the magistrate." If the Place du Palais Bourbon had been deserted at that moment, Don Luis would certainly have relieved himself by a swinging blow administered to Mazeroux's chin, according to the most scientific rules of the noble art. And Mazeroux foresaw this contingency, for he prudently kept as far away as possible and, to appease the chief's anger, intended a whole litany of excuses. "It was for your good, Chief. I had to do it. Only think, you yourself told me, 'Rid me of the creature,' said you. 'I'm too weak. You'll arrest her, won't you? Her eyes burn into me like poison.' Well, Chief, could I help it? No, I couldn't, could I? Especially as the deputy chief." "Ah, so Weber knows?" "Why, yes. The Prefect is a little suspicious of you, since he understood about the faking of the portrait. So M. Weber is coming back in an hour, perhaps, with reinforcements. Well, I was saying, the deputy chief had learned that the woman who used to go to Gaston Sauverand's at Neuilly, the house on the Boulevard Richard Wallace, was fair and very good looking, and that her name was Florence. She even used to stay the night sometimes." "You lie! You lie!" hissed Perenna. All his spite was reviving. He had been pursuing Florence with intentions which it would have been difficult for him to put into words. And now, suddenly, he again wanted to destroy her. And this time consciously. In reality, he no longer knew what he was doing. He was acting at haphazard, tossed about in turns by the most diverse passions, a prey to that inordinate love which impels us as readily to kill the object of our affections as to die in an attempt to save her. A newsboy passed with a special edition of the Paris Midi, showing in great black letters: "Sensational declaration by Don Luis Perenna. Mme. Fauville is innocent. Imminent arrest of the two criminals." "Yes, yes," he said aloud. "The drama is drawing to an end. Florence is about to pay her debt to society. So much the worse for her." He started his car again and drove through the gate. In the courtyard, he said to his chauffeur, who came up: "Turn her around and don't put her up. I may be starting again at any moment." He sprang out and asked the butler: "Is Mlle. Levasseur in?" "Yes, sir. She's in her room." "She was away yesterday, wasn't she?" "Yes, sir. She received a telegram asking her to go to the country, to see a relation who was ill. She came back last night." "I want to speak to her. Send her to me at once." "In the study, sir?" "No, upstairs, in the boudoir next to my bedroom." This was a small room on the second floor, which had once been a lady's boudoir, and he preferred it to his study since the attempt at murder of which he had been the object. He was quieter up there, farther away, and he kept his important papers there. He always carried the key with him, a special key with 3 grooves to it and an inner spring. Mazeroux had followed him into the courtyard and was keeping close behind him, apparently unobserved by Perenna, who, having so far, appeared not to notice it. He now, however, took the sergeant by the arm and led him to the front steps. "All is going well. I was afraid that Florence, suspecting something, might not have come back. But she probably doesn't know that I saw her yesterday. She can't escape us now." They went across the hall and up the stairs to the first floor. Mazeroux rubbed his hands. "So you've come to your senses, Chief?" "At any rate, I've made up my mind. I will not, do you hear, I will not have Mme. Fauville kill herself. And, as there is no other way of preventing that catastrophe, I shall sacrifice Florence." "Without regret?" "Without remorse." "Then you'll forgive me?" "I thank you." And he struck him a clean, powerful blow under the chin. Mazeroux fell without a moan, in a dead faint, on the steps of the second flight. Halfway up the stairs was a dark recess that served as a lumber room where the servants kept their pails and brooms and the soiled household linen. Don Luis carried Mazeroux to it, and, seating him comfortably on the floor, with his back to a housemaid's box, he stuffed his handkerchief into his mouth, gagged him with a towel, and bound his wrists and ankles with 2 tablecloths. The other ends of these he fastened to a couple of strong nails. As Mazeroux was slowly coming to himself, Don Luis said: "I think you have all you want: tablecloths, napkins, something in your mouth in case you're hungry. Eat at your ease. And then take a little nap, and you'll wake up as fresh as paint." He locked him in and glanced at his watch. "I have an hour before me. Capital." At that moment his intention was to insult Florence, to throw up all her scandalous crimes in her face, and in this way to force a written and signed confession from her. Afterward, when Marie Fauville's safety was ensured, he would see. Perhaps he would put Florence in his motor and carry her off to some refuge from which, with the girl for a hostage, he would be able to influence the police. Perhaps. But he did not seek to anticipate events. What he wanted was an immediate, violent explanation. He ran up to his bedroom on the second floor and dipped his face into cold water. Never had he experienced such a stimulation of his whole being, such an unbridling of his blind instincts. "It's she!" he spluttered. "I hear her. She is at the bottom of the stairs. At last! Oh, the joy of having her in front of me, face to face! She and I alone!" He returned to the landing outside the boudoir. He took the key from his pocket. The door opened. He uttered a great shout. Gaston Sauverand was there, in that locked room. Gaston Sauverand was waiting for him, standing with folded arms. Chapter 10. Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 10. Gaston Sauverand explains. Gaston Sauverand! Instinctively Don Luis took a step back, drew his revolver, and aimed it at the criminal. "Hands up!" he commanded. "Hands up, or I fire!" Sauverand did not appear to be put out. He nodded toward 2 revolvers which he had laid on a table beyond his reach, and said: "There are my arms. I have come here not to fight, but to talk." "How did you get in?" roared Don Luis, exasperated by this display of calmness. "A false key, I suppose. But how did you get hold of the key? How did you manage it?" The other did not reply. Don Luis stamped his foot. "Speak, will you? Speak! If not " But Florence ran into the room. She passed him by without his trying to stop her, flung herself upon Gaston Sauverand, and, taking no heed of Perenna's presence, said: "Why did you come? You promised me that you wouldn't. You swore it to me. Go!" Sauverand released himself and forced her into a chair. "Let me be, Florence. I promised only so as to reassure you. Let me be." "No, I will not!" exclaimed the girl eagerly. "It's madness. I won't have you say a single word. Oh, please, please stop!" He bent over her and smoothed her forehead, separating her mass of golden hair. "Let me do things my own way, Florence," he said softly. She was silent, as though disarmed by the gentleness of his voice; and he whispered more words which Don Luis could not hear and which seemed to convince her. Perenna had not moved. He stood opposite them with his arm outstretched and his finger on the trigger, aiming at the enemy. When Sauverand addressed Florence by her Christian name, he started from head to foot and his finger trembled. What miracle kept him from shooting? By what supreme effort of will did he stifle the jealous hatred that burned him like fire? And here was Sauverand daring to stroke Florence's hair! He lowered his arm. He would kill them later, do with them what he pleased, since they were in his power, and since nothing henceforth could snatch them from his vengeance. He took Sauverand's 2 revolvers and laid them in a drawer. Then he went back to the door, intending to lock it. But, hearing a sound on the first floor landing, he leaned over the balusters. The butler was coming upstairs with a tray in his hand. "What is it now?" "An urgent letter, sir, for Sergeant Mazeroux." "Sergeant Mazeroux is with me. Give me the letter and don't let me be disturbed again." He tore open the envelope. The letter, hurriedly written in pencil and signed by one of the inspectors on duty outside the house, contained these words: "Look out, Sergeant. Gaston Sauverand is in the house. 2 people living opposite say that the girl who was known hereabouts as the lady housekeeper came in at 1:30, before we took up our posts. She was next seen at the window of her lodge. A few moments later, a small, low door used for the cellars and situated under the lodge was opened, evidently by her. Almost at the same time a man entered the square, came along the wall, and slipped in through the cellar door. According to the description, it was Gaston Sauverand. So look out, Sergeant. At the least alarm, at the first signal from you, we shall come in." Don Luis reflected. He now understood how the scoundrel had access to his house, and how, hidden in the safest of retreats, he was able to escape every attempt to find him. He was living under the roof of the very man who had declared himself his most formidable adversary. "Come on," he said to himself. "The fellow's score is settled, and so is his young lady's. They can choose between the bullets in my revolver and the handcuffs of the police." He had ceased to think of his motor standing ready below. He no longer dreamed of flight with Florence. If he did not kill the two of them, the law would lay its hand upon them, the hand that does not let go. And perhaps it was better so, that society itself should punish the two criminals whom he was about to hand over to it. He shut the door, pushed the bolt, faced his two prisoners again, and, taking a chair, said to Sauverand: "Let us talk." Owing to the narrow dimensions of the room, they were all so close together that Don Luis felt as if he were almost touching the man whom he loathed from the very bottom of his heart. Their two chairs were hardly a yard asunder. A long table, covered with books, stood between them and the windows, which, hollowed out of the very thick wall, formed a recess, as is usual in old houses. Florence had turned her chair away from the light, and Don Luis could not see her face clearly. But he looked straight into Gaston Sauverand's face, and watched it with eager curiosity; and his anger was heightened by the sight of the still youthful features, the expressive mouth, and the intelligent eyes, which were fine in spite of their hardness. "Well, speak," said Don Luis, in a commanding tone. "I have agreed to a truce, but a momentary truce, just long enough to say what is necessary. Are you afraid, now that the time has arrived? Do you regret the step which you've taken?" The man smiled calmly and said: "I am afraid of nothing, and I do not regret coming, for I have a very strong intuition that we are bound to, come to an understanding." "An understanding?" protested Don Luis with a start. "Why not?" "A compact, an alliance between you and me." "Why not? It is a thought which I had already entertained more than once, which took a more precise shape in the magistrate's corridor, and which finally decided me when I read the announcement which you caused to be made in the special edition of this paper: 'Sensational declaration by Don Luis Perenna: Madame Fauville is innocent.'" Gaston Sauverand half rose from his chair, and, carefully picking his words, emphasizing them with sharp gestures, he whispered: "Everything lies, Monsieur, in those 4 words. Do those 4 words which you have written, which you have uttered publicly and solemnly, 'Madame Fauville is innocent,' do they express your real mind? Do you now absolutely believe in Marie Fauville's innocence?" Don Luis shrugged his shoulders. "Madame Fauville's innocence has nothing to do with the case. It is a question not of her, but of you too, and myself. So come straight to the point and as quickly as you can. It is to your interest even more than to mine." "To our interest?" "You forget the 3rd heading to the article," cried Don Luis. "I did more than proclaim Marie Fauville's innocence. I also announced, read for yourself, the imminent arrest of the criminals." Sauverand and Florence rose together, with the same unguarded movement. "And in your view the criminals are?" asked Sauverand. "Why, you know as well as I do. They are the man with the ebony walking stick, who at any rate cannot deny having murdered Chief Inspector Ancenis, and the woman who is his accomplice in all his crimes. Both of them must remember their attempts to assassinate me, the revolver shot on the Boulevard Suchet, the motor smash causing the death of my chauffeur, and yesterday again, in the barn, you know where, the barn with the 2 skeletons hanging from the rafters. Yesterday, you remember, the scythe, the relentless scythe which nearly beheaded me. And then? Well, then, the game is lost. You must pay up, and all the more so as you have foolishly put your heads into the lion's mouth." "I don't understand. What does all this mean?" "It simply means that they know Florence Levasseur, that they know you are both here, that the house is surrounded, and that Weber, the deputy chief inspector, is on his way." Sauverand appeared disconcerted by this unexpected threat. Florence, standing beside him, had turned livid. A mad anguish distorted her features. She stammered: "Oh, it's awful! No, I can't endure it!" And, rushing at Don Luis: "Coward! Coward! It's you who are betraying us! Coward! Oh, I knew that you were capable of the meanest treachery! There you stand like an executioner! Oh, you villain! You coward!" She fell into her chair, exhausted and sobbing, with her hand to her face. Don Luis turned away. Strange to say, he experienced no sense of pity; and Florence's tears affected him no more than her insults had done. no more than if he had never loved the girl. He was glad of this release. The horror with which she filled him had killed his love. But when he once more stood in front of them, after taking a few steps across the room, he saw that they were holding each other's hands, like two friends in distress, trying to give each other courage, and again yielding to a sudden impulse of hatred, for a moment beside himself, he gripped the man's arm. "I forbid you! By what right? Is she your wife? Your mistress? Then—" His voice became perplexed. He himself felt the strangeness of that fit of anger which suddenly revealed, in all its force and all its blindness, a passion which he thought dead; and he blushed, for Gaston Sauverand was looking at him in amazement, and he did not doubt that the enemy had penetrated his secret. A long pause followed, during which he met Florence's eyes, hostile eyes, full of rebellion and disdain. Had she too guessed? He dared not speak another word. He waited for Sauverand's explanation. And while waiting, he gave not a thought to the coming revelations, nor to the tremendous problems of which he was at last about to know the solution, nor to the tragic events at hand. He thought of one thing only, thought of it with the fevered throbbing of his whole being, thought of what he was on the point of learning about Florence, about the girl's affections, about her past, about her love for Sauverand. That alone interested him. "Very well," said Sauverand. "I am caught in a trap. Fate must take its course. Nevertheless, can I speak to you? It is the only wish that remains to me." "Speak," replied Don Luis. "The door is locked. I shall not open it until I think fit. Speak." "I shall be brief," said Gaston Sauverand. "For one thing, what I can tell you is not much. I do not ask you to believe it, but to listen to it as if I were possibly telling the truth, the whole truth." And he expressed himself in the following words: "I never met Hippolyte and Marie Fauville, though I used to correspond with them, you will remember that we were all cousins, until 5 years ago, when chance brought us together at Palmero. They were passing the winter there while their new house on the Boulevard Suchet was being built. We spent 5 months at Palmero, seeing one another daily. Hippolyte and Marie were not on the best of terms. One evening, after they had been quarrelling more violently than usual, I found her crying. Her tears upset me, and I could not longer conceal my secret. I had loved Marie from the first moment when we met. I was to love her always, and to love her more and more." "You lie!" cried Don Luis, losing his self-restraint. "I saw the two of you yesterday in the train that brought you back from Alençon." Gaston Sauverand looked at Florence. She sat silent, with her hands to her face and her elbows on her knees. Without replying to Don Luis's exclamation, he went on: "Marie also loved me. She admitted it, but made me swear that I would never try to obtain from her more than the purest friendship would allow. I kept my oath. We enjoyed a few weeks of incomparable happiness. Hippolyte Fauville, who had become enamoured of a music hall singer, was often away. I took a good deal of trouble with the physical training of the little boy Edmond, whose health was not what it should be. And we also had between us, the best of friends, the most devoted and affectionate counsellor, who staunched our wounds, kept up our courage, restored our gaiety, and bestowed some of her own strength and dignity upon our love. Florence was there." Don Luis felt his heart beating faster, not that he attached the least credit to Gaston Sauverand's words, but he had every hope of arriving, through those words, at the real truth. Perhaps, also, he was unconsciously undergoing the influence of Gaston Sauverand, whose apparent frankness and sincerity of tone caused him a certain surprise. Sauverand continued: "15 years before, my elder brother, Raoul Sauverand, had picked up at Buenos Ayres, where he had gone to live, a little girl, the orphan daughter of some friends. At his death he entrusted the child, who was then 14, to an old nurse who had brought me up and who had accompanied my brother to South America. The old nurse brought the child to me and herself died of an accident a few days after her arrival in France. I took the little girl to Italy to friends, where she worked and studied and became what she is. Wishing to live by her own resources, she accepted a position as teacher in a family. Later I recommended her to my Fauville cousins, with whom I found her at Palmero as governess to the boy Edmond, and especially as the friend, the dear and devoted friend, of Marie Fauville. She was mine also at that happy time, which was so sunny and all too short. Our happiness, in fact the happiness of all three of us, was to be wrecked in the most sudden and tantalizing fashion. Every evening I used to write in a diary the daily life of my love, an uneventful life, without hope or future before it, but eager and radiant. Marie Fauville was extolled in it as a goddess. Kneeling down to write, I sang litanies of her beauty, and I also used to invent, as a poor compensation, wholly imaginary scenes, in which she said all the things which she might have said but did not, and promised me all the happiness which we had voluntarily renounced. Hippolyte Fauville found the diary. His anger was something terrible. His first impulse was to get rid of Marie. But in the face of his wife's attitude, of the proofs of her innocence which she supplied, of her inflexible refusal to consent to a divorce, and of her promise never to see me again, he recovered his calmness. I left, with death in my soul. Florence left too, dismissed. And never, mark me, never, since that fatal hour, did I exchange a single word with Marie. But an indestructible love united us, a love which neither absence nor time was to weaken." He stopped for a moment, as though to read in Don Luis's face the effect produced by his story. Don Luis did not conceal his anxious attention. What astonished him most was Gaston Sauverand's extraordinary calmness, the peaceful expression of his eyes, the quiet ease with which he set forth, without hurrying, almost slowly, and so very simply, the story of that family tragedy. "What an actor!" he thought. And as he thought it, he remembered that Marie Fauville had given him the same impression. Was he then to hark back to his first conviction and believe Marie guilty, a dissembler like her accomplice, a dissembler like Florence? Or was he to attribute a certain honesty to that man? He asked: "And afterward?" "Afterward I travelled about. I resumed my life of work and pursued my studies wherever I went, in my bedroom at the hotels, and in the public laboratories of the big towns." "And Madame Fauville?" "She lived in Paris in her new house. Neither she nor her husband ever referred to the past." "How do you know? Did she write to you?" "No. Marie is a woman who does not do her duties by halves, and her sense of duty is strict to excess. She never wrote to me, but Florence, who had accepted a place as secretary and reader to Count Mologny, your predecessor in this house, used often to receive Marie's visits in her lodge downstairs. They did not speak of me once, did they, Florence? Marie would not have allowed it. But all her life and all her soul were nothing but love and passionate memories. Isn't that so, Florence? At last," he went on slowly, "weary of being so far away from her, I returned to Paris. That was our undoing. It was about a year ago. I took a flat in the Avenue du Roule and went to it in the greatest secrecy, so that Hippolyte Fauville might not know of my return. I was afraid of disturbing Marie's peace of mind. Florence alone knew, and came to see me from time to time. I went out little, only after dark, and in the most secluded parts of the Bois. But it happened, for our most heroic resolutions sometimes fail us, one Wednesday night at about 11 o'clock my steps led me to the Boulevard Suchet, without my noticing it, and I went past Marie's house. It was a warm and fine night, and, as luck would have it, Marie was at her window. She saw me, I was sure of it, and knew me. And my happiness was so great that my legs shook under me as I walked away. After that I passed in front of her house every Wednesday evening, and Marie was nearly always there, giving me this unhoped for and ever new delight, in spite of the fact that her social duties, her quite natural love of amusement, and her husband's position obliged her to go out a great deal." "Quick! Why can't you hurry?" said Don Luis, urged by his longing to know more. "Look sharp and come to the facts. Speak." He had become suddenly afraid lest he should not hear the remainder of the explanation, and he suddenly perceived that Gaston Sauverand's words were making their way into his mind as words that were perhaps not untrue. Though he strove to fight against them, they were stronger than his prejudices and triumphed over his arguments. The fact is that deep down in his soul, tortured with love and jealousy, there was something that disposed him to believe this man in whom hitherto he had seen only a hated rival, and who was so loudly proclaiming, in Florence's very presence, his love for Marie. "Hurry!" he repeated. "Every minute is precious." Sauverand shook his head. "I shall not hurry. All my words were carefully thought out before I decided to speak. Every one of them is essential. Not one of them can be omitted, for you will find the solution of the problem not in the facts presented anyhow, separated one from the other, but in the concatenation of the facts and in a story told as faithfully as possible." "Why? I don't understand." "Because the truth lies hidden in that story." "But that truth is your innocence, isn't it?" "It is Marie's innocence." "But I don't dispute it." "What is the use of that if you can't prove it?" "Exactly. It's for you to give me proofs." "I have none." "What?" "I tell you I have no proof of what I am asking you to believe." "Then I shall not believe it," cried Don Luis angrily. "No, and again no. Unless you supply me with the most convincing proofs, I shall refuse to believe a single word of what you are going to tell me." "You have believed everything that I have told you so far," Sauverand retorted very simply. Don Luis offered no denial. He turned his eyes to Florence Levasseur, and it seemed to him that she was looking at him with less aversion, and as though she were wishing with all her might that he would not resist the impressions that were forcing themselves upon him, he muttered: "Go on with your story." And there was something really strange about the attitude of those two men, one making his explanation in precise terms and in such a way as to give every word its full value, the other listening attentively and weighing every one of those words, both controlling their excitement, both as calm in appearance as though they were seeking the philosophical solution in a case of conscience. What was going on outside did not matter. What was to happen presently did not count. Before all, whatever the consequences of their inactivity at this moment, when the circle of the police was closing in around them, before all, it was necessary that one should speak and the other listen. "We are coming," said Sauverand in his grave voice. "We are coming to the most important events, to those of which the interpretation, which is new to you, but strictly true, will make you believe in our good faith. Ill luck having brought me across Hippolyte Fauville's path in the course of one of my walks in the Bois, I took the precaution of changing my abode and went to live in the little house on the Boulevard Richard Wallace, where Florence came to see me several times. I was even careful to keep her visits a secret and, moreover, to refrain from corresponding with her except through the poste restante. I was therefore quite easy in my mind. I worked in perfect solitude and in complete security. I expected nothing. No danger, no possibility of danger, threatened us. And I may say, to use a commonplace but very accurate expression, that what happened came as an absolute bolt from the blue. I heard at the same time, when the Prefect of Police and his men broke into my house and proceeded to arrest me, I heard at the same time and for the first time of the murder of Hippolyte Fauville, the murder of Edmond, and the arrest of my adored Marie." "Impossible!" cried Don Luis, in a renewed tone of aggressive wrath. "Impossible! Those facts were a fortnight old. I cannot allow that you had not heard of them." "Through whom?" "Through the papers!" exclaimed Don Luis. "And more certainly still through Mlle. Levasseur." "Through the papers?" said Sauverand. "I never used to read them. What, is that incredible? Are we under an obligation, an inevitable necessity, to waste half an hour a day in skimming through the futilities of politics and the piffle of the news columns? Is your imagination incapable of conceiving a man who reads nothing but reviews in scientific publications? The fact is rare, I admit," he continued, "but the rarity of a fact is no proof against it. On the other hand, on the very morning of the crime I had written to Florence, saying that I was going away for 3 weeks and bidding her good bye. I changed my mind at the last moment, but this she did not know; and thinking that I had gone, not knowing where I was, she was unable to inform me of the crime, of Marie's arrest or, later, when an accusation was brought against the man with the ebony walking stick, of the search that was being made for me." "Exactly," declared Don Luis. "You cannot pretend that the man with the ebony walking stick, the man who followed Inspector Vérot to the Café du Pont Neuf and purloined his letter—" "I am not the man," Sauverand interrupted. And when Don Luis shrugged his shoulders, he insisted, in a more forcible tone of voice: "I am not that man. There is some inexplicable mistake in all this, but I have never set foot in the Café du Pont Neuf. I swear it. You must accept this statement as positively true. Besides, it agrees entirely with the retired life which I was leading from necessity and from choice. And I repeat, I knew nothing. The thunderbolt was unexpected; and it was precisely for this reason, you must understand, that the shock produced in me an equally unexpected reaction, a state of mind diametrically opposed to my real nature, an outburst of my most savage and primitive instincts. Remember, monsieur, that they had laid hands upon what to me was the most sacred thing on earth. Marie was in prison. Marie was accused of committing 2 murders. I went mad. At first controlling myself, playing a part with the Prefect of Police, then overthrowing every obstacle, shooting Chief Inspector Ancenis, shaking off Sergeant Mazeroux, jumping from the window, I had only one thought in my head, that of escape. Once free, I should save Marie. Were there people in my way? So much the worse for them. By what right did those people dare to attack the most blameless of women? I killed only 1 man that day. I would have killed 10. I would have killed 20. What was Chief Inspector Ancenis's life to me? What cared I for the lives of any of those wretches? They stood between Marie and myself, and Marie was in prison. Chapter 10, Part 1. Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 10. Gaston Sauverand explains. Gaston Sauverand made an effort which contracted every muscle of his face to recover the coolness that was gradually leaving him. He succeeded in doing so, but his voice, nevertheless, remained tremulous, and the fever with which he was consumed shook his frame in a manner which he was unable to conceal. He continued: "At the corner of the street down which I turned after outdistancing the Prefect's men on the Boulevard Richard Wallace, Florence saved me just as I believed that all was lost. Florence had known everything for a fortnight past. She learned the news of the double murder from the papers, those papers which she used to read out to you and which you discussed with her. And it was by being with you, by listening to you, that she acquired the opinion, which everything that happened tended to confirm, the opinion that Marie's enemy, her only enemy, was yourself." "But why? Why?" "Because she saw you at work," exclaimed Sauverand. "Because it was more to your interest than to that of any one else that first Marie and then I should not come between you and the Mornington inheritance. And lastly—" "What?" Gaston Sauverand hesitated and then said plainly: "Lastly, because she knew your real name beyond a doubt, and because she felt that Arsène Lupin was capable of anything." They were both silent, and their silence, at such a moment, was impressive to a degree. Florence remained impassive under Don Luis Perenna's gaze, and he was unable to discern on her sealed face any of the feelings with which she must needs be stirred. Gaston Sauverand continued: "It was against Arsène Lupin, therefore, that Florence, Marie's terrified friend, engaged in the struggle. It was to unmask Lupin that she wrote, or rather inspired the article of which you found the original in a ball of string. It was Lupin whom she spied upon, day by day, in this house. It was Lupin whom she heard one morning telephoning to Sergeant Mazeroux and rejoicing in my imminent arrest. It was to save me from Lupin that she let down the iron curtain in front of him, at the risk of an accident, and took a taxi to the corner of the Boulevard Richard Wallace, where she arrived too late to warn me, as the detectives had already entered my house, but in time to screen me from their pursuit. Her mistrust and terror-stricken hatred of you were told to me in an instant," Sauverand declared. "During the 20 minutes which we employed in throwing our assailants off the scent, she hurriedly sketched the main lines of the business and described to me in a few words the leading part which you were playing in it, and we then and there prepared a counter-attack upon you, so that you might be suspected of complicity. While I was sending a message to the Prefect of Police, Florence went home and hid under the cushions of your sofa the end of the stick which I had kept in my hand without thinking. It was an ineffective parry and missed its aim, but the fight had begun, and I threw myself into it headlong. Monsieur, to understand my actions thoroughly, you must remember that I was a student, a man leading a solitary life, but also an ardent lover. I would have spent all my life in work, asking no more from fate than to see Marie at her window from time to time at night. But once she was being persecuted, another man arose within me, a man of action, bungling certainly, and inexperienced, but a man who was ready to stick at nothing, and who, not knowing how to save Marie Fauville, had no other object before him than to do away with that enemy of Marie's, to whom he was entitled to ascribe all the misfortunes that had befallen the woman he loved. This started the series of my attempts upon your life. Brought into your house, concealed in Florence's own rooms, I tried, unknown to her, that I swear, to poison you." He paused for an instant to mark the effect of his words, then went on: "Her reproaches, her abhorrence of such an act, would perhaps have moved me, but I repeat, I was mad, quite mad. And your death seemed to me to imply Marie's safety. And one morning, on the Boulevard Suchet, where I had followed you, I fired a revolver at you. The same evening, your motor car, tampered with by myself — remember, Florence's rooms are close to the garage — carried you, I hope, to your death, together with Sergeant Mazeroux, your confederate. That time again you escaped my vengeance. But an innocent man, the chauffeur who drove you, paid for you with his life. And Florence's despair was such that I had to yield to her entreaties and lay down my arms. I myself, terrified by what I had done, shattered by the remembrance of my two victims, changed my plans and thought only of saving Marie by contriving her escape from prison. I am a rich man. I lavished money upon Marie's warders, without, however, revealing my intentions. I entered into relations with the prison tradesmen and the staff of the infirmary; and every day, having procured a card of admission as a law reporter, I went to the law courts, to the examining magistrate's corridor, where I hoped to meet Marie, to encourage her with a look, a gesture, perhaps to slip a few words of comfort into her hand." Sauverand moved closer to Don Luis. "Her martyrdom continued. You struck her a most terrible blow with that mysterious business of Hippolyte Fauville's letters. What did those letters mean? Where did they come from? Were we not entitled to attribute the whole plot to you who introduced them into the horrible struggle? Florence watched you, I may say, night and day. We sought for a clue, a glimmer of light in the darkness. Well, yesterday morning Florence saw Sergeant Mazeroux arrive. She could not overhear what he said to you, but she caught the name of a certain Langernault and the name of Damigny, the village where Langernault lived. She remembered that old friend of Hippolyte Fauville's. Were the letters not addressed to him, and was it not in search of him that you were going off in the motor with Sergeant Mazeroux? Half an hour later we were in the train for Alençon. A carriage took us from the station to just outside Damigny, where we made our inquiries with every possible precaution. On learning what you must also know, that Langernault was dead, we resolved to visit his place, and we had succeeded in effecting an entrance when Florence saw you in the grounds. Wishing at all costs to avoid a meeting between you and myself, she dragged me across the lawn and behind the bushes. You followed us, however, and when a barn appeared in sight she pushed one of the doors which half opened and let us through. We managed to slip quickly through the lumber in the dark and knocked up against a ladder. This we climbed and reached a loft in which we took shelter. You entered at that moment. You know the rest, how you discovered the two hanging skeletons, how your attention was drawn to us by an imprudent movement of Florence, your attack, to which I replied by brandishing the first weapon with which chance provided me. Lastly, our flight through the window in the roof, under the fire of your revolver. We were free, but in the evening, in the train, Florence fainted. While bringing her to, I perceived that one of your bullets had wounded her in the shoulder. The wound was slight and did not hurt her, but it was enough to increase the extreme tension of her nerves. When you saw us, at the Le Mans station, wasn't it? She was asleep, with her head on my shoulder." Don Luis had not once interrupted the latter part of this narrative, which was told in a more and more agitated voice, and quickened by an accent of profound truth. Thanks to a superhuman effort of attention, he noted Sauverand's least words and actions in his mind. And as these words were uttered and these actions performed, he received the impression of another woman who rose up beside the real Florence, a woman unspotted, and innocent of all the shame which he had attributed to her on the strength of events. Nevertheless, he did not yet give in. How could Florence possibly be innocent? No, no. The evidence of his eyes, which had seen, and the evidence of his reason, which had judged, both rebelled against any such contention. He would not admit that Florence could suddenly be different from what she really was to him, a crafty, cunning, cruel, bloodthirsty monster. No, no, the man was lying with infernal cleverness. He put things with a skill amounting to genius, until it was no longer possible to differentiate between the false and the true, or to distinguish the light from the darkness. He was lying. He was lying. And yet how sweet were the lies he told! How beautiful was that imaginary Florence! The Florence compelled by destiny to commit acts which she loathed, but free of all crime, free of remorse, humane and pitiful, with her clear eyes and her snow-white hands. And how good it was to yield to this fantastic dream! Gaston Sauverand was watching the face of his former enemy. Standing close to Don Luis, his features lit up with the expression of feelings and passions which he no longer strove to check, he asked in a low voice: "You believe me, don't you?" "No, I don't," said Perenna, hardening himself to resist the man's influence. "You must!" cried Sauverand, with a fierce outburst of violence. "You must believe in the strength of my love. It is the cause of everything. My hatred for you comes only from my love. Marie is my life. If she were dead, there would be nothing for me to do but die. Oh, this morning, when I read in the papers that the poor woman had opened her veins, and through your fault, after Hippolyte's letters accusing her, I did not want to kill you so much as to inflict upon you the most barbarous tortures. My poor Marie, what a martyrdom she must be enduring! As you were not back, Florence and I wandered about all morning to have news of her, first around the prison, then to the police office and the law courts. And it was there, in the magistrates' corridor, that I saw you. At that moment you were mentioning Marie Fauville's name to a number of journalists, and you told them that Marie Fauville was innocent, and you informed them of the evidence which you possessed in Marie's favour. My hatred ceased then and there, monsieur. In 1 second the enemy had become the ally, the master to whom one kneels. So you had had the wonderful courage to repudiate all your work and to devote yourself to Marie's rescue. I ran off, trembling with joy and hope, and as I joined Florence I shouted, 'Marie is saved! He proclaims her innocent! I must see him and speak to him!' We came back here. Florence refused to lay down her arms and begged me not to carry out my plan before your new attitude in the case was confirmed by deeds. I promised everything that she asked, but my mind was made up; and my will was still further strengthened when I had read your declaration in the newspaper. I would place Marie's fate in your hands, whatever happened, and without an hour's delay I waited for your return and came up here." He was no longer the same man who had displayed such coolness at the commencement of the interview. Exhausted by his efforts and by a struggle that had lasted for weeks, costing him so much fruitless energy, He was now trembling and clinging to Don Luis, with one of his knees on the chair beside which Don Luis was standing. He stammered: "Save her, I implore you. You have it in your power. Yes, you can do anything. I learned to know you in fighting you. There was more than your genius defending you against me. There is a luck that protects you. You are different from other men. Why, the mere fact of your not killing me at once, though I had pursued you so savagely, the fact of your listening to the inconceivable truth of the innocence of all three of us, and accepting it as admissible, surely these constitute an unprecedented miracle. While I was waiting for you and preparing to speak to you, I received an intuition of it all," he exclaimed. "I saw clearly that the man who was proclaiming Marie's innocence, with nothing to guide him but his reason, I saw that this man alone could save her, and that he would save her. Oh, I beseech you, save her, and save her at once. Otherwise it will be too late. In a few days Marie will have ended her life. She cannot go on living in prison. You see, she means to die. No obstacle can prevent her. Can anyone be prevented from committing suicide? And how horrible if she were to die! Oh, if the law requires a criminal, I will confess anything that I am asked to. I will joyfully accept every charge and pay every penalty, provided that Marie is free. Save her! I do not know yet the best thing to be done. Save her from prison and death. Save her, for God's sake, save her." Tears flowed down his anguish-stricken face. Florence also was crying, bowed down with sorrow. And Perenna suddenly felt the most terrible dread steal over him. Although, ever since the beginning of the interview, a fresh conviction had gradually been mastering him, it was only, as it were, a glance that he became aware of it. Suddenly he perceived that his belief in Sauverand's words was unrestricted, and that Florence was perhaps not the loathsome creature that he had had the right to think, but a woman whose eyes did not lie, and whose face and soul were alike beautiful. Suddenly he learned that the two people before him, as well as Marie Fauville, for love of whom they had fought so unskilful a fight, were imprisoned in an iron circle which their efforts would not succeed in breaking. And that circle, traced by an unknown hand, he, Perenna, had drawn tighter around them with the most ruthless determination. "If only it is not too late," he muttered. He staggered under the shock of the sensations and ideas that crowded upon him. Everything clashed in his brain with tragic violence: certainty, joy, dismay, despair, fury. He was struggling in the clutches of the most hideous nightmare, and he already seemed to see a detective's heavy hand descending on Florence's shoulder. Come away!" he cried, starting up in alarm. "It is madness to remain." "But the house is surrounded," Sauverand objected. "And then? Do you think that I will allow for a second? No, come. We must fight side by side. I shall still entertain some doubts, that is certain. You must destroy them, and we will save Mme. Fauville." "But the detectives round the house?" "We'll manage them." "Weber, the deputy chief?" "He's not here, and as long as he's not here I'll take everything on myself. Come, follow me, but at some little distance. When I give the signal, and not till then." He drew the bolt and turned the handle of the door. At that moment some one knocked. It was the butler. "Well?" asked Don Luis. "Why am I disturbed?" "The deputy chief detective, M. Weber, is here, sir." Chapter 11 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 11. Routed. Don Luis had certainly expected this formidable blow, and yet it appeared to take him unawares, and he repeated more than once: "Ah, Weber is here! Weber is here!" All his buoyancy left him, and he felt like a retreating army which, after almost making good its escape, suddenly finds itself brought to a stop by a steep mountain. Weber was there, that is to say, the chief leader of the enemies, the man who would be sure to plan the attack and the resistance in such a manner as to dash Perenna's hopes to the ground. With Weber at the head of the detectives, any attempt to force a way out would have been absurd. "Did you let him in?" he asked. "You did not tell me not to, sir." "Is he alone?" "No, sir. The deputy chief has 6 men with him. He has left them in the courtyard." "And where is he?" "He asked me to take him to the first floor. He expected to find you in your study, sir." "Does he know now that I am with Sergeant Mazeroux and Mlle. Levasseur?" "Yes, sir." Perenna thought for a moment and then said: "Tell him that you have not found me and that you are going to look for me in Mlle. Levasseur's rooms. Perhaps he will go with you. All the better if he does." And he locked the door again. The struggle through which he had just passed did not show itself on his face. And now that all was lost, now that he was called upon to act, he recovered that wonderful composure which never abandoned him at decisive moments. He went up to Florence. She was very pale and was silently weeping. He said: "You must not be frightened, mademoiselle. If you obey me implicitly, you will have nothing to fear." She did not reply, and he saw that she still mistrusted him, and he almost rejoiced at the thought that he would compel her to believe in him. "Listen to me," he said to Sauverand. "In case I should not succeed after all, there are still several things which you must explain." "What are they?" asked Sauverand, who had lost none of his coolness. Then, collecting all his riotous thoughts, resolved to omit nothing, but at the same time to speak only what was essential, Don Luis asked in a calm voice: "Where were you on the morning before the murder, when a man carrying an ebony walking stick and answering to your description entered the Café du Pont Neuf immediately after Inspector Vérot?" "At home." "Are you sure that you did not go out?" "Absolutely sure, and I am also sure that I have never been to the Café du Pont Neuf, of which I had never even heard." "Good. Next question. Why, when you learned all about this business, did you not go to the Prefect of Police or the examining magistrate? It would have been simpler for you to give yourself up and tell the exact truth than to engage in this unequal fight." "I was thinking of doing so. But I at once realized that the plot hatched against me was so clever that no bare statement of the truth would have been enough to convince the authorities. They would never have believed me. What proof could I supply? None at all. Whereas, on the other hand, the proofs against us were overwhelming and undeniable. Were not the marks of the teeth evidence of Marie's undoubted guilt? And were not my silence, my flight, the shooting of Chief Inspector Ancenis so many crimes? No, if I would rescue Marie, I must remain free." "But she could have spoken herself." "And confessed our love? Apart from the fact that her womanly modesty would have prevented her, what good would it have done? On the contrary, it meant lending greater weight to the accusation. That was just what happened when Hippolyte Fauville's letters, appearing one by one, revealed to the police the as yet unknown motives of the crimes imputed to us. We loved each other." "How do you explain the letters?" "I can't explain them. We did not know of Fauville's jealousy. He kept it to himself. And then again, why did he suspect us? What can have put it into his head that we meant to kill him? Where did his fears, his nightmares come from? It is a mystery. He wrote that he had letters of ours in his possession. What letters?" "And the marks of the teeth, those marks which were undoubtedly made by Mme. Fauville?" "I don't know. It is all incomprehensible." "You don't know, either, what she can have done after leaving the opera between 12 and 2 in the morning?" "No. She was evidently lured into a trap. But how and by whom? And why does she not say what she was doing? More mystery." "You were seen that evening, the evening of the murders, at Auteuil station. What were you doing there?" "I was going to the Boulevard Suchet, and I passed under Marie's windows. Remember that it was a Wednesday. I came back on the following Wednesday, and, still knowing nothing of the tragedy or of Marie's arrest, I came back again on the second Wednesday, which was the evening on which you found out where I lived and informed Sergeant Mazeroux against me. Another thing, did you know of the Mornington inheritance?" "No, nor Florence either, and we have every reason to think that Marie and her husband knew no more about it than we did." "That barn at Damigny, was it the first time that you had entered it?" "Yes, and our astonishment at the sight of the two skeletons hanging from the rafters equalled yours." Don Luis was silent. He cast about for a few seconds longer to see if he had any more questions to ask. Then he said: "That is all I wanted to know. Are you, on your side, certain that everything that is necessary has been said?" "Yes." "This is a serious moment. It is possible that we may not meet again. Now you have not given me a single proof of your statements." "I have told you the truth. To a man like yourself, the truth is enough. As for me, I am beaten. I give up the struggle. Or rather, I place myself under your orders. Save Marie." "I will save the three of you," said Perenna. "The fourth of the mysterious letters is to make its appearance to morrow. That leaves ample time for us to lay our heads together and study the matter fully. And to morrow evening I shall go there, and, with the help of all that you have told me, I shall prove the innocence of you all. The essential thing is to be present at the meeting on the 25th of May. Please think only of Marie. Sacrifice me if necessary. Sacrifice Florence even. I am speaking in her name as well as my own when I tell you that it is better to desert us than to jeopardize the slightest chance of success." "I will save the three of you," Perenna repeated. He pushed the door ajar and, after listening outside, said: "Don't move and don't open the door to anybody, on any pretext whatever, before I come to fetch you. I shall not be long." He locked the door behind him and went down to the first floor. He did not feel those high spirits which usually cheered him on the eve of his great battles. This time Florence Levasseur's life and liberty were at stake, and the consequences of a defeat seemed to him worse than death. Through the window on the landing he saw the detectives guarding the courtyard. He counted 6 of them. And he also saw the deputy chief at one of the windows of his study, watching the courtyard and keeping in touch with his detectives. By Jove, he thought, he's sticking to his post. It will be a tough job. He suspects something. However, let's make a start. He went through the drawing room and entered his study. Weber saw him. The two enemies were face to face. There was a few seconds' silence before the duel opened, the duel which was bound to be swift and vigorous, without the least sign of weakness or distraction on either side. It could not last longer than 3 minutes. The deputy chief's face bore an expression of mingled joy and anxiety. For the first time he had permission, he had orders to fight that accursed Don Luis, against whom he had never yet been able to satisfy his hatred. And his delight was all the greater because he held every trump, whereas Don Luis had put himself in the wrong by defending Florence Levasseur and tampering with the girl's portrait. On the other hand, Weber did not forget that Don Luis was identical with Arsène Lupin, and this consideration caused him a certain uneasiness. He was obviously thinking, "The least blunder and I'm done for." He crossed swords with a jest. "I see that you were not in Mademoiselle Levasseur's lodge, as your man pretended." "My man spoke in accordance with my instructions. I was in my bedroom upstairs. But I wanted to finish the job before I came down." "And is it done?" "It's done. Florence Levasseur and Gaston Sauverand are in my room, gagged and bound. You have only to accept delivery of the goods." "Gaston Sauverand!" cried Weber. "Then it was he who was seen coming in?" "Yes. He was simply living with Florence Levasseur, whose lover he is." "Oh, ho!" said the deputy chief, in a bantering tone. "Her lover?" "Yes. And when Sergeant Mazeroux brought Florence Levasseur to my room, to question her out of hearing of the servants, Sauverand, foreseeing the arrest of his mistress, had the audacity to join us. He tried to rescue her from our hands." "And you checkmated him?" "Yes." It was clear that the deputy chief did not believe one word of the story. He knew through M. Desmalions and Mazeroux that Don Luis was in love with Florence. And Don Luis was not the man even through jealousy to hand over a woman whom he loved. He increased his attention. "Good business," he said. "Take me up to your room. Was it a hard struggle?" "Not very. I managed to disarm the scoundrel. All the same, Mazeroux got stabbed in the thumb." "Nothing serious?" "Oh, dear, no. But he has gone to have his wound dressed at the chemist's." The deputy chief stopped, greatly surprised. "What? Isn't Mazeroux in your room with the two prisoners?" "I never told you that he was." "No, but your butler—" "The butler made a mistake. Mazeroux went out a few minutes before you came." "It's funny," said Weber, watching Don Luis closely, "but my men all think he's here. They haven't seen him go out." "They haven't seen him go out?" echoed Don Luis, pretending to feel anxious. "But then where can he be? He told me he wanted to have his thumb seen to." The deputy chief was growing more and more suspicious. Evidently, Perenna was trying to get rid of him by sending him in search of the sergeant. "I will send one of my men," he said. "Is the chemist's near?" "Just around the corner, in the Rue de Bourgogne. Besides, we can telephone." "Oh, we can telephone," muttered Weber. He was quite at a loss and looked like a man who does not know what is going to happen next. He moved slowly toward the instrument, while barring the way to Don Luis to prevent his escaping. Don Luis therefore retreated to the telephone box, as if forced to do so, took down the receiver with one hand and, calling, "Hullo! Hullo! Saxe, 2409," with the other hand, which was resting against the wall, he cut one of the wires with a pair of pliers which he had taken off the table as he passed. "Hullo! Are you there? Is that 2409? Are you the chemist? Hullo! Sergeant Mazeroux of the detective service is with you, isn't he? Eh? What? What do you say? But it's too awful! Are you sure? Do you mean to say the wound is poisoned?" Without thinking what he was doing, the deputy chief pushed Don Luis aside and took hold of the receiver. The thought of the poisoned wound was too much for him. "Are you there?" he cried, keeping an eye on Don Luis and motioning to him not to go away. "Are you there? Eh? It's Deputy Chief Weber, of the detective office, speaking. Hullo! Are you there? I want to know about Sergeant Mazeroux. Are you there? Oh, hang it, why don't you answer?" Suddenly he let go the instrument, looked at the wires, perceived that they had been cut, and turned round, showing a face that clearly expressed the thought in his mind. "That's done it. I've been tricked." Perenna was standing a couple of yards behind him, leaning carelessly against the woodwork of the arch, with his left hand passed between his back and the woodwork. He was smiling pleasantly, kindly and genially. "Don't move," he said, with a gesture of his right hand. Weber, more frightened by that smile than he would have been by threats, took good care not to move. "Don't move," repeated Don Luis in a very queer voice. "And whatever you do, don't be alarmed. You shan't be hurt, I promise you. Just 5 minutes in a dark cell for a naughty little boy. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3 bang!" He stood aside and pressed the button that worked the iron curtain. The heavy panel came crashing to the floor. The deputy chief was a prisoner. "That's 100 million francs gone to Jericho," grinned Don Luis. "A pretty trick, but a bit expensive. Good bye, Mornington inheritance. Good bye, Don Luis Perenna. And now, my dear Lupin, if you don't want Weber to take his revenge, beat a retreat and in good order. 1, 2, left, right." As he spoke, he locked, on the inside, the folding doors between the drawing room and the first floor anteroom. Then, returning to his study, he locked the door between this room and the drawing room. The deputy chief was banging at the iron curtain with all his might and shouting so loud that they were bound to hear him outside through the open window. "You're not making half enough noise, deputy," cried Don Luis. "Let's see what we can do." He took his revolver and fired off 3 bullets, one of which broke a pane. Then he quickly left his study by a small, massive door, which he carefully closed behind him. He was now in a secret passage which ran round both rooms and ended at another door leading to the anteroom. He opened this door wide and was thus able to hide behind it. Attracted by the shots and the noise, the detectives were already rushing through the hall and up the staircase. When they reached the first floor and had gone through the anteroom, as the drawing-room doors were locked, the only outlet open to them was the passage, at the end of which they could hear the deputy shouting. They all 6 darted down it. When the last of them had vanished round the bend in the passage, Don Luis softly pushed back the door that concealed him and locked it like the rest. The 6 detectives were as safely imprisoned as the deputy chief. "Bottled," muttered Don Luis. "It will take them quite 5 minutes to realize the situation, to bang at the locked doors and to break down one of them. In 5 minutes we shall be far away." He met 2 of his servants running up with scared faces, the chauffeur and the butler. He flung each of them a 1,000-franc note and said to the chauffeur: "Set the engine going, there's a sportsman, and let no one near the machine to block my way. 2,000 francs more for each of you if I get off in the motor. Don't stand staring at me like that. I mean what I say. 2,000 francs apiece. It's for you to earn it. Look sharp." He himself went up the second flight without undue haste, remaining master of himself. But on the last stair he was seized with such a feeling of elation that he shouted: "Victory! The road is clear!" The boudoir door was opposite. He opened it and repeated: "Victory! But there's not a second to lose. Follow me." He entered. A stifled oath escaped his lips. The room was empty. "What?" he stammered. "What does this mean? They're gone. Florence." Certainly, unlikely though it seemed, he had hitherto supposed that Sauverand possessed a false key to the lock. But how could they both have escaped in the midst of the detectives? He looked around him. And then he understood. In the recess containing the window, the lower part of the wall, which formed a very wide box underneath the casement, had the top of its woodwork raised and resting against the panes, exactly like the lid of a chest. And inside the open chest he saw the upper rungs of a narrow descending ladder. In a second Don Luis conjured up the whole story of the past. Count Malonyi's ancestress, hiding in the old family mansion, escaping the search of the perquisitors, and in this way living throughout the revolutionary troubles. Everything was explained. A passage contrived in the thickness of the wall led to some distant outlet. And this was how Florence used to come and go through the house. This was how Gaston went in and out in all security. And this also was how both of them were able to enter his room and surprise his secrets. "Why not have told me?" he wondered. "A lingering suspicion, I suppose." But his eyes were attracted by a sheet of paper on the table. With a feverish hand, Gaston Sauverand had scribbled the following lines in pencil: "We are trying to escape so as not to compromise you. If we are caught, it can't be helped. The great thing is that you should be free. All our hopes are centred in you." Below were 2 words written by Florence: "Save Marie." "Oh," he murmured, disconcerted by the turn of events and not knowing what to decide. Why did they not obey my instructions? We are separated now." Downstairs the detectives were battering at the door of the passage in which they were imprisoned. Perhaps he would still have time to reach his motor before they succeeded in breaking down the door. Nevertheless, he preferred to take the same road as Florence and Sauverand, which gave him the hope of saving them and of rescuing them in case of danger. He therefore stepped over the side of the chest, placed his foot on the top rung and went down. Some 20 bars brought him to the middle of the first floor. Here, by the light of his electric lantern, he entered a sort of low, vaulted tunnel, dug, as he thought, in the wall, and so narrow that he could only walk along it sideways. 30 yards farther there was a bend, at right angles, and next, at the end of another tunnel of the same length, a trap door, which stood open, revealing the rungs of a second ladder. He did not doubt that the fugitives had gone this way. It was quite light at the bottom. Here he found himself in a cupboard which was also open, and which on ordinary occasions must have been covered by curtains that were now drawn. This cupboard faced a bed that filled almost the whole space of an alcove. On passing through the alcove, and reaching a room from which it was separated only by a slender partition, to his great surprise he recognized Florence's sitting room. This time he knew where he was. The exit, which was not secret, as it led to the Place du Palais Bourbon, but nevertheless very safe, was that which Sauverand generally used when Florence admitted him. Don Luis therefore went through the entrance hall and down the steps, and a little way before the pantry came upon the cellar stairs. He ran down these and soon recognized the low door that served to admit the wine casks. The daylight filtered in through a small grated spy hole. He groped till he found the lock. Glad to have come to the end of his expedition, he opened the door. "Hang it all!" he growled, leaping back and clutching at the lock, which he managed to fasten again. 2 policemen in uniform were guarding the exits, 2 policemen who had tried to seize him as he appeared. Where did those 2 men come from? Had they prevented the escape of Sauverand and Florence? But in that case Don Luis would have met the 2 fugitives, as he had come by exactly the same road as they. No, he thought, they effected their flight before the exit was watched. But by Jove, it's my turn to clear out, and that's not easy. Shall I let myself be caught in my burrow like a rabbit? He went up the cellar stairs again, intending to hasten matters, to slip into the courtyard through the outhouses, to jump into his motor, and to clear a way for himself. But when he was just reaching the yard, near the coach house, he saw 4 detectives, 4 of those whom he had imprisoned, come up waving their arms and shouting. And he also became aware of a regular uproar near the main gate and the porter's lodge. A number of men were all talking together, raising their voices in violent discussion. Perhaps he might profit by this opportunity to steal outside under cover of the disorder. At the risk of being seen, he put out his head, and what he saw astounded him. Gaston Sauverand stood with his back to the wall of the lodge, surrounded by policemen and detectives, who pushed and insulted him. The handcuffs were on his wrists. Gaston Sauverand a prisoner! What had happened between the 2 fugitives and the police? His heart wrung with anguish, he leaned out still farther. But he did not see Florence. The girl had no doubt succeeded in escaping. Weber's appearance on the steps and the deputy chief's first words confirmed his hopes. Weber was mad with rage. His recent captivity and the humiliation of his defeat exasperated him. "Ah!" he roared, as he saw the prisoner. "There's one of them, at any rate. Gaston Sauverand. Choice game, that. Where did you catch him?" "On the Place du Palais Bourbon," said one of the inspectors. "We saw him slinking out through the cellar door." "And his accomplice, the Levasseur girl?" "We missed her, Deputy Chief. She was the first out." "And Don Luis? You haven't let him leave the house, I hope? I gave orders." "He tried to get out through the cellar door 5 minutes after." "Who said so?" "One of the men in uniform posted outside the door." "Well?" "The beggar went back into the cellar." Weber gave a shout of delight. "We've got him! And it's a nasty business for him. Charge of resisting the police. Complicity. We shall be able to unmask him at last. Tally ho, my lads, tally ho! 2 men to guard Sauverand, 4 men on the Place du Palais Bourbon, revolver in hand, 2 men on the roof, the rest stick to me. We'll begin with the Levasseur girl's room, and we'll take his room next. Hark, forward, my lads!" Don Luis did not wait for the enemy's attack. Knowing their intentions, he beat a retreat, unseen, toward Florence's rooms. Here, as Weber did not yet know the short cut through the outhouses, he had time to make sure that the trap door was in perfect working order, and that there was no reason why they should discover the existence of a secret cupboard at the back of the alcove, behind the curtains of the bed. Once inside the passage, he went up the first staircase, followed the long corridor contrived in the wall, climbed the ladder leading to the boudoir, and, perceiving that this second trap door fitted the woodwork so closely that no one could suspect anything, he closed it over him. A few minutes later, he heard the noise of men making a search above his head. And so, on the 24th of May, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the position was as follows: Florence Levasseur with a warrant out against her, Gaston Sauverand in prison, Marie Fauville in prison and refusing all food, and Don Luis, who believed in their innocence and who alone could have saved them. Don Luis was being blockaded in his own house and hunted down by a score of detectives. As for the Mornington inheritance, there could be no more question of that, because the legatee, in his turn, had set himself in open rebellion against society. "Capital," said Don Luis, with a grin. "This is life as I understand it. The question is a simple one and may be put in different ways. How can a wretched, unwashed beggar, with not a penny in his pocket, make a fortune in 24 hours without setting foot outside his hovel? How can a general, with no soldiers and no ammunition left, win a battle which he has lost? In short, how shall I, Arsène Lupin, manage to be present to morrow evening at the meeting which will be held on the Boulevard Suchet, and to behave in such a way as to save Marie Fauville, Florence Levasseur, Gaston Sauverand, and my excellent friend Don Luis Perenna in the bargain?" Dull blows came from somewhere. The men must be hunting the roofs and sounding the walls. Don Luis stretched himself flat on the floor, hid his face in his folded arms, and, shutting his eyes, murmured: "Let's think." Chapter 12 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 12. Help. When Lupin afterward told me this episode of the tragic story, he said, not without a certain self-complacency: "What astonished me then, and what astonishes me still, as one of the most amazing victories on which I am entitled to pride myself, is that I was able to admit Sauverand and Marie Fauville's innocence on the spot, as a problem solved once and for all. It was a first-class performance, I swear, and surpassed the most famous deductions of the most famous investigators, both in psychological value and in detective merit. After all, taking everything into account, there was not the shadow of a fresh fact to enable me to alter the verdict. The charges accumulated against the two prisoners were the same, and were so grave that no examining magistrate would have hesitated for a second to commit them for trial, nor any jury to bring them in guilty. I will not speak of Marie Fauville. You had only to think of the marks of her teeth to be absolutely certain. But Gaston Sauverand, the son of Victor Sauverand and consequently the heir of Cosmo Mornington, Gaston Sauverand, the man with the ebony walking stick and the murderer of Chief Inspector Ancenis, was he not just as guilty as Marie Fauville, incriminated with her by the mysterious letters, incriminated by the very revelation of the husband whom they had killed? "And yet why did that sudden change take place in me?" he asked. "Why did I go against the evidence? Why did I credit an incredible fact? Why did I admit the inadmissible? Why? Well, no doubt, because truth has an accent that rings in the ears in a manner all its own. On the one side, every proof, every fact, every reality, every certainty. On the other, a story told by one of the three criminals, and therefore, presumptively, absurd and untrue from start to finish. But a story told in a frank voice, a clear, dispassionate, closely woven story, free from complications or improbabilities, a story which supplied no positive solution, but which, by its very honesty, obliged an impartial mind to reconsider the solution arrived at. I believed the story." The explanation which Lupin gave me was not complete. I asked: "And Florence Levasseur?" "Florence?" "Yes. You don't tell me what you thought. What was your opinion about her? Everything tended to incriminate her, not only in your eyes, because, logically speaking, she had taken part in all the attempts to murder you, but also in the eyes of the police. They knew that she used to pay Sauverand clandestine visits at his house on the Boulevard Richard Wallace. They had found her photograph in Inspector Vérot's memorandum book. And then all the rest, your accusations, your certainties. Was all that modified by Sauverand's story? To your mind, was Florence innocent or guilty?" He hesitated, seemed on the point of replying directly and frankly to my question, but could not bring himself to do so, and said: "I wished to have confidence. In order to act, I must have full and entire confidence, whatever doubts might still assail me, whatever darkness might still enshroud this or that part of the adventure. I therefore believed, and believing, I acted according to my belief." Acting, to Don Luis Perenna, during those hours of forced inactivity, consisted solely in perpetually repeating to himself Gaston Sauverand's account of the events. He tried to reconstitute it in all its details, to remember the very least sentences, the apparently most insignificant phrases; and he examined those sentences, scrutinized those phrases, one by one, in order to extract such particle of the truth as they contained. For the truth was there, Sauverand had said so, and Perenna did not doubt it. The whole sinister affair, all that constituted the case of the Mornington inheritance and the tragedy of the Boulevard Suchet, all that could throw light upon the plot hatched against Marie Fauville, all that could explain the undoing of Sauverand and Florence, all this lay in Sauverand's story. Don Luis had only to understand, and the truth would appear like the moral which we draw from some obscure fable. Don Luis did not once deviate from his method. If any objection suggested itself to his mind, he at once replied: "Very well, it may be that I am wrong and that Sauverand's story will not enlighten me on any point capable of guiding me. It may be that the truth lies outside it. But am I in a position to get at the truth in any other way? All that I possess is an instrument of research, without attaching undue importance to certain gleams of light which the regular appearance of the mysterious letters has shed upon the case. All that I possess is Gaston Sauverand's story. Must I not make use of it?" And once again, as when one follows a path by another person's tracks, he began to live through the adventure which Sauverand had been through. He compared it with the picture of it which he had imagined until then. The two were in opposition, but could not the very clash of their opposition be made to produce a spark of light? "Here is what he said," he thought, "and there is what I believed. What does the difference mean? Here is the thing that was, and there is the thing that appeared to be. Why did the criminal wish the thing that was to appear under that particular aspect? To remove all suspicion from him. But in that case, was it necessary that suspicions should fall precisely on those whom it did?" The questions came crowding one upon the other. He sometimes answered them at random, mentioning names and uttering words in succession, as though the name mentioned might be just that of the criminal, and the words uttered those which contained the unseen reality. Then at once he would take up the story again, as schoolboys do when parsing and analyzing a passage in which each expression is carefully sifted, each period discussed, each sentence reduced to its essential value. Hours and hours passed. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, he gave a start. He took out his watch. By the light of his electric lamp, he saw that it was 17 minutes to 12. "So at 17 minutes to 12 at night," he said, "I fathomed the mystery." He tried to control his emotion, but it was too great; and his nerves were so immensely staggered by the trial that he began to shed tears. He had caught sight of the appalling truth, all of a sudden, as when at night one half sees a landscape under a lightning flash. There is nothing more unnerving than this sudden illumination when we have been groping and struggling in the dark. Already exhausted by his physical efforts and by the want of food, from which he was beginning to suffer, he felt the shock so intensely that, without caring to think a moment longer, he managed to go to sleep, or rather to sink into sleep, as one sinks into the healing waters of a bath. When he woke, in the small hours, alert and well despite the discomfort of his couch, he shuddered on thinking of the theory which he had accepted, and his first instinct was to doubt it. He had, so to speak, no time. All the proofs came rushing to his mind of their own accord and at once transformed the theory into one of those certainties which it would be madness to deny. It was that and nothing else. As he had foreseen, the truth lay recorded in Sauverand's story. And he had not been mistaken, either, in saying to Mazeroux that the manner in which the mysterious letters appeared had put him on the track of the truth. And the truth was terrible. He felt, at the thought of it, the same fears that had maddened Inspector Vérot when, already tortured by the poison, he stammered: "Oh, I don't like this. I don't like the look of this. The whole thing has been planned in such an infernal manner." Infernal was the word, and Don Luis remained stupefied at the revelation of a crime which looked as if no human brain could have conceived it. For 2 hours more he devoted all his mental powers to examining the situation from every point of view. He was not much disturbed about the result, because, being now in possession of the terrible secret, he had nothing more to do but make his escape and go that evening to the meeting on the Boulevard Suchet, where he would show them all how the murder was committed. But when, wishing to try his chance of escaping, he went up through the underground passage and climbed to the top of the upper ladder, that is to say, to the level of the boudoir, he heard through the trap door the voices of men in the room. "By Jove," he said to himself, "the thing is not so simple as I thought. In order to escape the minions of the law, I must first leave my prison. And here is at least one of the exits blocked. Let's look at the other." He went down to Florence's apartments and worked the mechanism, which consisted of a counterweight. The panel of the cupboard moved in the groove. Driven by horror and hoping to find some provisions which enable him to withstand a siege without being reduced to famine, he was about to pass through the alcove, behind the curtains, when he was stopped short by a sound of footsteps. Someone had entered the room. "Well, Mazeroux, have you spent the night here? Nothing new?" Don Luis recognized the Prefect of Police by his voice, and the question put by the Prefect told him, first, that Mazeroux had been released from the dark closet where he had bound him up, and secondly, that the sergeant was in the next room. Fortunately, the sliding panel had worked without the least sound, and Don Luis was able to overhear the conversation between the two men. "No, nothing new, Monsieur le Préfet," replied Mazeroux. "That's funny. The confounded fellow must be somewhere. Or can he have got away over the roof?" "Impossible, Monsieur le Préfet," said a third voice, which Don Luis recognized as that of Weber, the deputy chief detective. "Impossible. We made certain yesterday that, unless he has wings " "Then what do you think, Weber?" "I think, Monsieur le Préfet, that he is concealed in the house. This is an old house and probably contains some safe hiding place." Of course," said M. Desmalions, whom Don Luis, peeping through the curtains, saw walking to and fro in front of the alcove. "You're right. And we shall catch him in his burrow. Only, is it really necessary?" "Monsieur le Préfet!" "Well, you know my opinion on the subject, which is also the Prime Minister's opinion. Unearthing Lupin would be a blunder which we should end by regretting. After all, he's become an honest man, you know. He's useful to us and he does no harm." "No harm, Monsieur le Préfet? You really think so?" said Weber stiffly. M. Desmalions burst out laughing. "Oh, of course, yesterday's trick, the telephone trick! You must admit it was funny. The Premier had to hold his sides when I told him of it." "Upon my word, I see nothing to laugh at." "No, but all the same, the rascal is never at a loss. Funny or not, the trick was extraordinarily daring. To cut the telephone wire before your eyes and then blockade you behind that iron curtain! By the way, Mazeroux, you must get the telephone repaired this morning, so as to keep in touch with the office. Have you begun your search in these two rooms?" "As you ordered, Monsieur le Préfet. The deputy chief and I have been hunting round for the last hour." "Yes," said M. Desmalions, "that Florence Levasseur strikes me as a troublesome creature. She is certainly an accomplice. But what were her relations with Sauverand, and what was her connection with Don Luis Perenna? That's what I should like to know. Have you discovered nothing in her papers?" "No, Monsieur le Préfet," said Mazeroux. "Nothing but bills and tradesmen's letters." "And you, Weber?" "I found something very interesting, Monsieur le Préfet." Weber spoke in a triumphant tone and, in answer to M. Desmalions's question, went on: "This is a volume of Shakespeare, Monsieur le Préfet, volume 8. You will see that, contrary to the other volumes, the inside is empty and the binding forms a secret receptacle for hiding documents." "Yes, what sort of documents?" "Here they are, sheets of paper, blank sheets, all but 3. One of them gives a list of the dates on which the mysterious letters were to appear." "Oho!" said M. Desmalions. "That's a crushing piece of evidence against Florence Levasseur. And also it tells us where Don Luis got his list from." Perenna listened with surprise. He had utterly forgotten this particular; and Gaston Sauverand had made no reference to it in his narrative. And yet it was a strange and serious detail. From whom had Florence received that list of dates? "And what's on the other 2 sheets?" asked M. Desmalions. Don Luis pricked up his ears. Those 2 other sheets had escaped his attention on the day of his interview with Florence in this room. "Here is one of them," said Weber. M. Desmalions took the paper and read: "Bear in mind that the explosion is independent of the letters and that it will take place at 3 o'clock in the morning." "Yes," he said, "the famous explosion which Don Luis foretold and which is to accompany the 5th letter, as announced on the list of dates. Tush! We have plenty of time, as there have been only 3 letters and the 4th is due to night. Besides, blowing up that house on the Boulevard Suchet would be no easy job, by Jove! Is that all?" "Monsieur le Préfet," said Weber, producing the 3rd sheet, "would you mind looking at these lines drawn in pencil and enclosed in a large square containing some other smaller squares and rectangles of all sizes? Wouldn't you say that it was the plan of a house?" "Yes, I should." "It is the plan of the house in which we are," declared Weber solemnly. "Here you see the front courtyard, the main building, the porter's lodge, and over there Mlle. Levasseur's lodge. From this lodge a dotted line, in red pencil, starts zigzagging toward the main building. The commencement of this line is marked by a little red cross which stands for the room in which we are, or, to be more correct, the alcove. You will see here something like the design of a chimney, or rather a cupboard recessed behind the bed and probably hidden by the curtains." "But in that case, Weber," said M. Desmalions, "this dotted line must represent a passage leading from this lodge to the main building. Look, there is also a little red cross at the other end of the line." "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet, there is another cross. We shall discover later for certain what position it marks. But meanwhile, and acting on a mere guess, I have posted some men in a small room on the 2nd floor where the last secret meeting between Don Luis, Florence Levasseur, and Gaston Sauverand was held yesterday. And meanwhile, at any rate, we hold one end of the line, and through that very fact we know Don Luis Perenna's retreat." There was a pause, after which the deputy chief resumed in a more and more solemn voice: Monsieur le Préfet, yesterday I suffered a cruel outrage at the hands of that man. It was witnessed by our subordinates. The servants must be aware of it. The public will know of it before long. This man has brought about the escape of Florence Levasseur. He tried to bring about the escape of Gaston Sauverand. He is a ruffian of the most dangerous type. Monsieur le Préfet, I am sure that you will not refuse me leave to dig him out of his hole. Otherwise, Monsieur le Préfet, I shall feel obliged to hand in my resignation." "With good reasons to back it up," said the Prefect, laughing. "There's no doubt about it. You can't stomach the trick of the Iron Curtain. Well, go ahead. It's Don Luis's own lookout. He's brought it on himself. Mazeroux, ring me up at the office as soon as the telephone is put right. And both of you meet me at the Fauvilles' house this evening. Don't forget it's the night for the fourth letter." "There won't be any fourth letter, Monsieur le Préfet," said Weber. "Why not?" "Because between this and then Don Luis will be under lock and key." "Oh, so you accuse Don Luis also of—" Don Luis did not wait to hear more. He softly retreated to the cupboard, took hold of the panel and pushed it back without a sound. So his hiding place was known! "By Jingo," he growled, "this is a bit awkward. I'm in a nice plight." He had run halfway along the underground passage, with the intention of reaching the other exit, but he stopped. "It's not worth while, as the exit's watched. Well, let's see. Am I to let myself be collared? Wait a bit, let's see." Already there came from the alcove below a noise of blows striking on the panel, the hollow sound of which had probably attracted the deputy chief's attention. And as Weber was not compelled to take the same precautions as Don Luis, and seemed to be breaking down the panel without delaying to look for the mechanism, the danger was close at hand. "Oh, hang it all!" muttered Don Luis. "This is too silly. What shall I do? Have a dash at them? Ah, if I had all my strength!" But he was exhausted by want of food. His legs shook beneath him and his brain seemed to lack its usual clearness. The increasing violence of the blows in the alcove drove him, in spite of all, toward the upper exit, and as he climbed the ladder he moved his electric lantern over the stones of the wall and the wood of the trap door. He even tried to lift the door with his shoulder, but he again heard a sound of footsteps above his head. The men were still there. Then, consumed with fury and helpless, he awaited the deputy's coming. A crash came from below. Its echo spread through the tunnel, followed by a tumult of voices. "That's it," he said to himself. "The handcuffs, the lockup, the cell. Good Lord, what luck! And what nonsense! And Marie Fauville, who's sure to do away with herself. And Florence. Before extinguishing his lantern, he cast its light around him for the last time. At a couple of yards' distance from the ladder, about 3/4 of the way up and set a little way back, there was a big stone missing from the inner wall, leaving a space just large enough to crouch in. Although the recess did not form much of a hiding place, it was just possible that they might omit to inspect it. Besides, Don Luis had no choice. At all events, after putting out the light, he leaned toward the edge of the hole, reached it, and managed to scramble in by bending himself in two. Weber, Mazeroux, and their men were coming along. Don Luis propped himself against the back of his hiding hole to avoid as far as possible the glare of the lanterns, of which he was beginning to see the gleams. And an amazing thing happened. The stone against which he was pushing toppled over slowly, as though moving on a pivot, and he fell backward into a second cavity situated behind it. He quickly drew his legs after him, and the stone swung back as slowly as before, not, however, without sending down a quantity of small stones, crumbling from the wall and half covering his legs. "Well, well!" he chuckled. "Can Providence be siding with virtue and righteousness?" He heard Mazeroux's voice saying: "Nobody. And here's the end of the passage, unless he ran away as we came. Look, through the trap door at the top of this ladder." Weber replied: "Considering the slope by which we've come, it's certain that the trap door is on a level with the second floor. Well, the other little cross ought to mark the boudoir on the second floor, next to Don Luis's bedroom. That's what I supposed, and why I posted 3 of our men there. If he's tried to get out on that side, he's caught." "We've only got to knock," said Mazeroux. "Our men will find the trap door and let us out. If not, we will break it down." More blows echoed down the passage. 15 or 20 minutes after, the trap door gave way, and other voices now mingled with Weber's and Mazeroux's. During this time, Don Luis examined his domain and perceived how extremely small it was. The most that he could do was to sit in it. It was a gallery, or, rather, a sort of gut, 1.5 yards long and ending in an orifice, narrower still, heaped up with bricks. The walls, besides, were formed of bricks, some of which were lacking, and the building stones which these should have kept in place crumbled at the least touch. The ground was strewn with them. By Jove, thought Lupin, I must not wriggle about too much, or I shall risk being buried alive. A pleasant prospect. Not only this, but the fear of making a noise kept him motionless. As a matter of fact, he was close to two rooms occupied by the detectives, first the boudoir and then the study, for the boudoir, as he knew, was over that part of his study which included the telephone box. The thought of this suggested another. On reflection, remembering that he used sometimes to wonder how Count Malonyi's ancestress had managed to keep alive behind the curtain on the days when she had to hide there, he realized that there must have been a communication between the secret passage and what was now the telephone box, a communication too narrow to admit a person's body, but serving as a ventilating shaft. As a precaution, in case the secret passage was discovered, a stone concealed the upper aperture of this shaft. Count Malonyi must have closed up the lower end when he restored the wainscoting of the study. So there he was, imprisoned in the thickness of the walls, with no very definite intention beyond that of escaping from the clutches of the police. More hours passed. Gradually, tortured with hunger and thirst, he fell into a heavy sleep, disturbed by painful nightmares which he would have given much to be able to throw off. But he slept too deeply to recover consciousness until 8 o'clock in the evening. When he woke up, feeling very tired, he saw his position in an unexpectedly hideous light, and at the same time, so accurately that, yielding to a sudden change of opinion marked by no little fear, he resolved to leave his hiding place and give himself up. Anything was better than the torture which he was enduring and the dangers to which longer waiting exposed him. But on turning round to reach the entrance to his hole, he perceived first that the stone did not swing over when merely pushed, and next, after several attempts, that he could not manage to find the mechanism which no doubt worked the stone. He persisted. His exertions were all in vain. The stone did not budge. Only at each exertion a few bits of stone came crumbling from the upper part of the wall and still further narrowed the space in which he was able to move. It cost him a considerable effort to master his excitement and to say jokingly: "That's capital. I shall be reduced now to calling for help. I, Arsène Lupin. Yes, to call in the help of those gentlemen of the police. Otherwise, the odds on my being buried alive will increase every minute. They're 10 to 1 as it is." He clenched his fists. "Hang it, I'll get out of this scrape by myself. Call for help? Not if I know it." He summoned up all his energies to think, but his jaded brain gave him none but confused and disconnected ideas. He was haunted by Florence's image and by Marie Fauville's as well. "It's to night that I'm to save them," he said to himself, "and I certainly will save them, as they are not guilty and as I know the real criminal. But how shall I set about it to succeed?" He thought of the Prefect of Police, of the meeting that was to take place at Fauville's house on the Boulevard Suchet. The meeting had begun, the police were watching the house; and this reminded him of the sheet of paper found by Weber in the 8th volume of Shakespeare's plays, and of the sentence written on it, which the Prefect had read out: "Bear in mind that the explosion is independent of the letters, and that it will take place at 3 o'clock in the morning." "Yes," thought Don Luis, accepting M. Desmalions's reasoning. "Yes, in 10 days' time. As there have been only 3 letters, the 4th will appear to night, and the explosion will not take place until the 5th letter appears. That is in 10 days from now." He repeated: "In 10 days, with the 5th letter. In 10 days." And suddenly he gave a start of fright. A horrible vision had flashed across his mind, a vision only too real. The explosion was to occur that very night! And all at once, knowing that he knew the truth, all at once, in a revival of his usual clear sightedness, he accepted the theory as certain. No doubt, only 3 letters had appeared out of the mysterious darkness, but 4 letters ought to have appeared, because one of them had appeared not on the date fixed, but 10 days later. And this for a reason which Don Luis knew. Besides, it was not a question of all this. It was not a question of seeking the truth amid this confusion of dates and letters, amid this intricate tangle in which no one could lay claim to any certainty. No, one thing alone stood out above the situation: the sentence, "Bear in mind that the explosion is independent of the letters." And as the explosion was put down for the night of the 25th of May, it would occur that very night, at 3 o'clock in the morning. "Help! Help!" he cried. This time he did not hesitate. So far, he had had the courage to remain huddled in his prison and to wait for the miracle that might come to his assistance. But he preferred to face every danger and undergo every penalty rather than abandon the Prefect of Police, Weber, Mazeroux, and their companions to the death that threatened them. "Help! Help!" Fauville's house would be blown up in 3 or 4 hours. That he knew with the greatest certainty. Just as punctually as the mysterious letters had reached their destination in spite of all the obstacles in the way, so the explosion would occur at the hour named. The infernal artificer of the accursed work had wished it so. At 3 o'clock in the morning there would be nothing left of the Fauvilles' house. "Help! Help!" He recovered enough strength to raise desperate shouts and to make his house carry beyond the stones and beyond the wainscoting. Then, when there seemed to be no answer to his call, he stopped and listened for a long time. There was not a sound. The silence was absolute. Thereupon a terrible anguish covered him with a cold sweat. Supposing the detectives had ceased to watch the upper floors and confined themselves to spending the night in the rooms on the ground floor? He madly took a brick and struck it repeatedly against the stone that closed the entrance, hoping that the noise would spread through the house. But an avalanche of small stones, loosened by the blows, at once fell upon him, knocking him down again and fixing him where he lay. "Help! Help!" More silence, a great ruthless silence. "Help! Help!" He felt that his shouts did not penetrate the walls that stifled him. Besides, his voice was growing fainter and fainter, producing a hoarse groan that died away in his strained throat. He ceased his cries and again listened, with all his anxious attention, to the great silence that surrounded as with layers of lead the stone coffin in which he lay imprisoned. Still nothing, not a sound. No one would come to his assistance. He continued to be haunted by Florence's name and image. And he thought also of Marie Fauville, whom he had promised to save. But Marie would die of starvation; and like her, like Gaston Sauverand and so many others, he in his turn was the victim of this monstrous horror. An incident occurred to increase his dismay. All of a sudden his electric lantern, which he had left alight to dispel the terrors of the darkness, went out. It was 11 o'clock at night. He was overcome with a fit of giddiness. He could hardly breathe in the close and vitiated air. His brain suffered, as it were, a physical and exceedingly painful ailment, from the repetition of images that seemed to encrust themselves there, and it was always Florence's beautiful features or Marie's livid face. And in his distraught brain, while Marie lay dying, he heard the explosion at the Fauvilles' house, and saw the Prefect of Police and Mazeroux lying hideously mutilated, dead. A numbness crept over him. He fell into a sort of swoon, in which he continued to stammer confused syllables. "Florence, Marie, Marie." Chapter 13. Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 13. The Explosion. The fourth mysterious letter. The fourth of those letters, posted by the devil and delivered by the devil, as one of the newspapers expressed it. We all of us remember the really extraordinary agitation of the public as the night of the 25th of May drew near, and fresh news increased this interest to a yet higher degree. People heard in quick succession of the arrest of Sauverand, the flight of his accomplice, Florence Levasseur, Don Luis Perenna's secretary, and the inexplicable disappearance of Perenna himself, whom they insisted, for the best of reasons, on identifying with Arsène Lupin. The police, assured from this moment of victory and having nearly all the actors in the tragedy in their power, had gradually given way to indiscretion; and, thanks to the particulars revealed to this or that journalist, the public knew of Don Luis's change of attitude, suspected his passion for Florence Levasseur and the real cause of his right about face, and thrilled with excitement as they saw that astonishing figure enter upon a fresh struggle. What was he going to do? If he wanted to save the woman he loved from prosecution, and to release Marie and Sauverand from prison, he would have to intervene some time that night, to take part, somehow or other, in the event at hand, and to prove the innocence of the three accomplices, either by arresting the invisible bearer of the fourth letter, or by suggesting some plausible explanation. In short, he would have to be there, and that was interesting indeed. And then the news of Marie Fauville was not good. With unwavering obstinacy, she persisted in her suicidal plans. She had to be artificially fed, and the doctors in the infirmary at Saint Lazare did not conceal their anxiety. Would Don Luis Perenna arrive in time? Lastly, there was that one other thing, the threat of an explosion which was to blow up Hippolyte Fauville's house 10 days after the delivery of the fourth letter, a really impressive threat when it was remembered that the enemy had never announced anything that did not take place at the stated hour. And although it was still 10 days, At least so people thought. From the date fixed for the catastrophe, the threat made the whole business look more and more sinister. That evening, therefore, a great crowd made its way, through La Muette and Auteuil, to the Boulevard Suchet, a crowd coming not only from Paris, but also from the suburbs and the provinces. The spectacle was exciting and people wanted to see. They saw only from a distance, for the police had barred the approaches 100 yards from either side of the house, and were driving into the ditches of the fortifications all those who managed to climb the opposite slope. The sky was stormy, with heavy clouds revealed at intervals by the light of a silver moon. There were lightning flashes and peals of distant thunder. Men sang, street boys imitated the noises of animals. People formed themselves into groups on the benches and pavements and ate and drank while discussing the matter. A part of the night was spent in this way, and nothing happened to reward the patience of the crowd, who began to wonder, somewhat wearily, if they would not do better to go home, seeing that Sauverand was in prison, and that there was every chance that the fourth letter would not appear in the same mysterious way as the others. And yet they did not go. Don Luis Perenna was due to come. From 10 o'clock in the evening, the Prefect of Police and his Secretary General, the Chief Detective and Weber, his deputy, Sergeant Mazeroux, and 2 detectives were gathered in the large room in which Fauville had been murdered. 15 more detectives occupied the remaining rooms, while some 20 others watched the roofs, the outside of the house, and the garden. Once again a thorough search had been made during the afternoon, with no better results than before. But it was decided that all the men should keep awake. If the letter was delivered anywhere in the big room, they wanted to know, and they meant to know who brought it. The police do not recognize miracles. At 12 o'clock, M. Desmalions had coffee served to his subordinates. He himself took 2 cups and never ceased walking from one end to the other of the room, or climbing the staircase that led to the attic, or going through the passage and hall. Preferring that the watch should be maintained under the most favourable conditions, he left all the doors opened and all the electric lights on. Mazeroux objected. "It has to be dark for the letter to come. You will remember, Monsieur le Préfet, that the other experiment was tried before, and the letter was not delivered." "We will try it again," replied M. Desmalions, who, in spite of everything, was really afraid of Don Luis's interference, and increased his measures to make it impossible. Meanwhile, as the night wore on, the minds of all those present became impatient. Prepared for the angry struggle as they were, they longed for the opportunity to show their strength. They made desperate use of their ears and eyes. At 1 o'clock, there was an alarm which showed the pitch which the nervous tension had reached. A shot was fired on the first floor, followed by shouts. On inquiry, it was found that 2 detectives, meeting in the course of a round, had not recognized each other, and one of them had discharged his revolver in the air to inform his comrades. In the meantime, the crowd outside had diminished, as M. Desmalions perceived on opening the garden gate. The orders had been relaxed, and sightseers were allowed to come nearer, though they were still kept at a distance from the pavement. Mazeroux said: "It is a good thing that the explosion is due in 10 days' time and not to night, Monsieur le Préfet. Otherwise all those good people would be in danger as well as ourselves." "There will be no explosion in 10 days' time, any more than there will be a letter to night," said M. Desmalions, shrugging his shoulders. And he added: "Besides, on that day the orders will be strict." It was now 10 minutes past 2. At 25 minutes past, as the Prefect was lighting a cigar, the Chief Detective ventured to joke: "That's something you will have to do without next time, Monsieur le Préfet. It would be too risky." "Next time," said M. Desmalions, "I shall not waste time in keeping watch, for I really begin to think that all this business with the letters is over." "You can never tell," suggested Mazeroux. A few minutes more passed. M. Desmalions had sat down. The others also were seated. No one spoke. And suddenly they all sprang up, with one movement and the same expression of surprise. A bell had rung. They at once heard where the sound came from. "The telephone," M. Desmalions muttered. He took down the receiver. "Hullo, who are you?" A voice answered, but so distant and so faint that he could only catch an incoherent noise, and exclaimed: "Speak louder! What is it? Who are you?" The voice spluttered out a few syllables that seemed to astound him. "Hullo!" he said. "I don't understand. Please repeat what you said. Who is it speaking?" "Don Luis Perenna," was the answer, more distinctly this time. The Prefect made as though to hang up the receiver, and he growled: "It's a hoax! Some rotter amusing himself at our expense." Nevertheless, in spite of himself, he went on in a gruff voice: "Look here, what is it? You say you're Don Luis Perenna?" "Yes." "What do you want? What's the time?" "What's the time?" The Prefect made an angry gesture, not so much because of the ridiculous question as because he had really recognized Don Luis's voice beyond mistake. "Well?" he said, controlling himself. "What's all this about? Where are you?" "At my house, above the iron curtain, in the ceiling of my study." "In the ceiling?" repeated the Prefect, not knowing what to think. "Yes, and more or less done for, I confess." "We'll send and help you out," said M. Desmalions, who was beginning to enjoy himself. "Later on, Monsieur le Préfet. First, answer me, quickly. If not, I don't know that I shall have the strength. What's the time?" "Oh, look here!" "I beg of you!" "It's 20 minutes to 3." 20 minutes to 3! It was as though Don Luis found renewed strength in a sudden fit of fear. His weak voice recovered its emphasis, and by turns imperious, despairing, and beseeching, full of a conviction which he did his utmost to impart to M. Desmalions, he said: "Go away, Monsieur le Préfet. Go, all of you. Leave the house. The house will be blown up at 3 o'clock. Yes, I swear it will. 10 days after the fourth letter means now, because there has been a 10 days' delay in the delivery of the letters. It means now, at 3 o'clock in the morning. Remember what was written on the sheet which Deputy Chief Weber handed you this morning. The explosion is independent of the letters. It will take place at 3 o'clock in the morning. At 3 o'clock in the morning, today, Monsieur le Préfet." The voice faltered and then continued: "Go away, please. Let no one remain in the house. You must believe me. I know everything about the business, and nothing can prevent the threat from being executed. Go, go, go! This is horrible. I feel that you do not believe me, and I have no strength left. Go away, every one of you." He said a few more words which M. Desmalions could not make out. Then the voice ceased, and though the Prefect still heard cries, it seemed to him that those cries were distant, as though the instrument were no longer within the reach of the mouth that uttered them. He hung up the receiver. "Gentlemen," he said with a smile, "it is 17 to 3. In 17 minutes we shall all be blown up together. At least, that is what our good friend Don Luis Perenna declares." In spite of the jokes with which this threat was met, there was a general feeling of uneasiness. Weber asked: "Was it really Don Luis, Monsieur le Préfet?" "Don Luis in person. He has gone to earth in some hiding hole in his house, above the study; and his fatigue and privations seem to have unsettled him a little. Mazeroux, go and ferret him out, unless this is just some fresh trick on his part. You have your warrant." Sergeant Mazeroux went up to M. Desmalions. His face was pallid. "Monsieur le Préfet, did he tell you that we were going to be blown up?" "He did. He relies on the note which M. Weber found in a volume of Shakespeare. The explosion is to take place to night." "At 3 o'clock in the morning?" "At 3 o'clock in the morning, that is to say, in less than a quarter of an hour." "And do you propose to remain, Monsieur le Préfet?" "What next, Sergeant? Do you imagine that we are going to obey that gentleman's fancies?" Mazeroux staggered, hesitated, and then, despite all his natural deference, unable to control himself, exclaimed: "Monsieur le Préfet, it's not a fancy. I have worked with Don Luis. I know the man. If he tells you that something is going to happen, it's because he has his reasons." "Absurd reasons." No, Monsieur le Préfet," Mazeroux pleaded, growing more and more excited. "I swear that you must listen to him. The house will be blown up. He said so, at 3 o'clock. We have a few minutes left. Let us go. I entreat you, Monsieur le Préfet." "In other words, you want us to run away." "But it's not running away, Monsieur le Préfet. It's a simple precaution. After all, we can't You, yourself, Monsieur le Préfet." "That will do." "But, Monsieur le Préfet, as Don Luis said " "That will do, I say," repeated the Prefect harshly. "If you're afraid, you can take advantage of the order which I gave you and go off after Don Luis." Mazeroux clicked his heels together and, old soldier that he was, saluted: "I shall stay here, Monsieur le Préfet." And he turned and went back to his place at a distance. Chapter 13 Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 13. The Explosion. Silence followed. M. Desmalions began to walk up and down the room, with his hands behind his back. Then, addressing the chief detective and the secretary general: "You are of my opinion, I hope?" he said. "Why, yes, Monsieur le Préfet." "Well, of course, to begin with, that supposition is based on nothing serious. And besides, we are guarded, aren't we? Bombs don't come tumbling on one's head like that. It takes some one to throw them. Well, how are they to come? By what way?" "Same way as the letters," the secretary general ventured to suggest. "What's that? Then you admit The secretary general did not reply, and M. Desmalions did not complete his sentence. He himself, like the others, experienced that same feeling of uneasiness which gradually, as the seconds sped past, was becoming almost intolerably painful. 3 o'clock in the morning. The words kept on recurring to his mind. Twice he looked at his watch. There was 12 minutes left. There was 10 minutes. Was the house really going to be blown up, by the mere effect of an infernal and all-powerful will? "It's senseless, absolutely senseless!" he cried, stamping his foot. But on looking at his companions, he was amazed to see how drawn their faces were, and he felt his courage sink in a strange way. He was certainly not afraid, and the others were no more afraid than he; but all of them, from the chiefs to the simple detectives, were under the influence of that Don Luis Perenna whom they had seen accomplishing such extraordinary feats, and who had shown such wonderful ability throughout this mysterious adventure. Consciously or unconsciously, whether they wished it or no, they looked upon him as an exceptional being endowed with special faculties, a being of whom they could not think without conjuring up the image of the amazing Arsène Lupin, with his legend of daring, genius, and superhuman insight. And Lupin was telling them to fly! Pursued and hunted as he was, he voluntarily gave himself up to warn them of their danger. And the danger was immediate. 7 minutes more, 6 minutes more, and the house would be blown up. With great simplicity, Mazeroux went on his knees, made the sign of the cross, and said his prayers in a low voice. The action was so impressive that the secretary general and the chief detective made a movement as though to go toward the Prefect of Police. M. Desmalions turned away his head and continued his walk up and down the room. But his anguish increased, and the words which he had heard over the telephone rang in his ears. And all Perenna's authority, his ardent entreaties, his frenzied conviction, all this upset him. He had seen Perenna at work. He felt it borne in upon him that he had no right, in the present circumstances, to neglect the man's warning. "Let's go," he said. The words were spoken in the calmest manner, and it really seemed as if those who heard them regarded them merely as the sensible conclusion of a very ordinary state of affairs. They went away without hurry or disorder, not as fugitives, but as men deliberately obeying the dictates of prudence. They stood back at the door to let the Prefect go first. "No," he said, "go on, I'll follow you." He was the last out, leaving the electric light full on. In the hall he asked the chief detective to blow his whistle. When all the plainclothesmen had assembled, he sent them out of the house together with the porter, and shut the door behind him. Then, calling the detectives who were watching the boulevard, he said: "Let everybody stand a good distance away. Push the crowd as far back as you can. And be quick about it. We shall enter the house again in half an hour." "And you, Monsieur le Préfet?" whispered Mazeroux. "You won't remain here, I hope?" "No, that I shan't," he said, laughing. "If I take our friend Perenna's advice at all, I may as well take it thoroughly." "There is only 2 minutes left." "Our friend Perenna spoke of 3 o'clock, not of 2 minutes to 3. So—" He crossed the boulevard, accompanied by his secretary general, the chief detective, and Mazeroux, and clambered up the slope of the fortifications opposite the house. "Perhaps we ought to stoop down," suggested Mazeroux. "Let's stoop, by all means," said the Prefect, still in a good humour. "But, honestly, if there's no explosion, I shall send a bullet through my head. I could not go on living after making myself look so ridiculous." "There will be an explosion, Monsieur le Préfet," declared Mazeroux. "What confidence you must have in our friend Don Luis!" "You have just the same confidence, Monsieur le Préfet." They were silent, irritated by the wait, and struggling with the absurd anxiety that oppressed them. They counted the seconds singly, by the beating of their hearts. It was interminable. 3 o'clock sounded from somewhere. "You see," grinned M. Desmalions in an altered voice, "you see, there's nothing, thank goodness." And he growled: "It's idiotic, perfectly idiotic. How could any one imagine such nonsense?" Another clock struck farther away. Then the hour also rang from the roof of a neighbouring building. Before the third stroke had sounded, they heard a kind of cracking; and the next moment came the terrible blast, complete, but so brief that they had only, so to speak, a vision of an immense sheaf of flames and smoke shooting forth enormous stones and pieces of wall, something like the grand finale of a fireworks display. And it was all over. The volcano had erupted. "Look sharp!" shouted the Prefect of Police, darting forward. "Telephone for the engines, quick, in case of fire." He caught Mazeroux by the arm. "Run to my motor. You'll see her 100 yards down the boulevard. Tell the man to drive you to Don Luis, and if you find him, release him and bring him here." "Under arrest, Monsieur le Préfet?" "Under arrest? You're mad!" "But if the deputy chief—" "The deputy chief will keep his mouth shut. I'll see to that. Be off." Mazeroux fulfilled his mission, not with greater speed than if he had been sent to arrest Don Luis, for Mazeroux was a conscientious man, but with extraordinary pleasure. The fight which he had been obliged to wage against the man whom he still called the chief had often distressed him to the point of tears. This time he was coming to help him, perhaps to save his life. That afternoon the deputy chief had ceased his search of the house, by M. Desmalions's orders, as Don Luis's escape seemed certain, and left only 3 men on duty. Mazeroux found them in a room on the ground floor, where they were sitting up in turns. In reply to his questions, they declared that they had not heard a sound. He went upstairs alone, so as to have no witnesses to his interview with the governor, passed through the drawing room, and entered the study. Here he was overcome with anxiety, for after turning on the light, the first glance revealed nothing to his eyes. "Chief!" he cried repeatedly. "Where are you, Chief?" No answer. "And yet," thought Mazeroux, "as he telephoned, he can't be far away." In fact, he saw from where he stood that the receiver was hanging from its cord; and, going on to the telephone box, he stumbled over bits of brick and plaster that strewed the carpet. He then switched on the light in the box as well, and saw a hand and arm hanging from the ceiling above him. The ceiling was broken up all around that arm, but the shoulder had not been able to pass through, and Mazeroux could not see the captive's head. He sprang on to a chair and reached the hand. He felt it and was reassured by the warmth of its touch. "Is that you, Mazeroux?" asked a voice that seemed to the sergeant to come from very far away. "Yes, it's I. You're not wounded, are you? Nothing serious?" "No, only stunned and a bit faint from hunger. Listen to me." "I'm listening." "Open the second drawer on the left in my writing desk. You'll find—" "Yes, Chief?" "An old stick of chocolate. But do as I tell you, Alexandre. I'm famished." Indeed, Don Luis recovered after a moment or two and said, in a gayer voice: "That's better. I can wait now. Go to the kitchen and fetch me some bread and some water." "I'll be back at once, Chief." "Not this way. Come back by Florence Levasseur's room and the secret passage to the ladder which leads to the trap door at the top." And he told him how to make the stone swing out, and how to enter the hollow in which he had expected to meet with such a tragic end. The thing was done in 10 minutes. Mazeroux cleared the opening, caught hold of Don Luis by the legs, and pulled him out of his hole. "Oh, dear! Oh, dear!" he moaned, in a voice full of pity. "What a position, Chief! How did you manage it all? Yes, I see. You must have dug down where you lay, and gone on digging for more than a yard. And it took some pluck, I expect, on an empty stomach." When Don Luis was seated in his bedroom and had swallowed a few bits of bread and drunk what he wanted, he told his story. "Yes, it took the devil's own pluck, old man. By Jingo, when a chap's ideas are whirling in his head and he can't use his brain, upon my word, all he asks is to die. And then there was no air, you see. I couldn't breathe. I went on digging, however, as you saw. Went on digging while I was half asleep, in a sort of nightmare. Just look, my fingers are in a jelly. But there, I was thinking of that confounded business of the explosion, and I wanted to warn you at all costs, and I dug away at my tunnel. What a job! And then, oof, I felt space at last. I got my hand through and next my arm. Where was I? Why, over the telephone, of course. I knew that at once by feeling the wall and finding the wires. Then it took me quite half an hour to get hold of the instrument. I couldn't reach it with my arm. I managed at last with a piece of string and a slip knot to fish up the receiver and hold it near my mouth, or say at 10 inches from my mouth. And then I shouted and roared to make my voice carry, and all the time I was in pain. And then at last my string broke, and then I hadn't an ounce of strength left in my body. Besides, you fellows had been warned, and it was for you to get yourselves out of the mess." He looked at Mazeroux and asked him as though certain of the reply: "The explosion took place, didn't it?" "Yes, Chief." "At 3 o'clock exactly?" "Yes." "And of course M. Desmalions had the house cleared?" "Yes." "At the last minute?" "At the last minute." Don Luis laughed and said: "I knew he would wait about and not give way until the crucial moment. You must have had a bad time of it, my poor Mazeroux, for of course you agreed with me from the start." He kept on eating while he talked, and each mouthful seemed to bring back a little of his usual animation. "Funny thing, hunger," he said. "Makes you feel so light-headed. I must practice getting used to it, however. At any rate, Chief, no one would believe that you've been fasting for nearly 48 hours. Ah, that comes of having a sound constitution, with something to fall back upon. I shall be a different man in half an hour. Just give me time to shave and have a bath." When he had finished dressing, he sat down to the breakfast of eggs and cold meat which Mazeroux had prepared for him, and then, getting up, said: "Now let's be off." But there's no hurry, Chief. Why don't you lie down for a few hours? The Prefect can wait." "You're mad. What about Marie Fauville?" "Marie Fauville? Why, of course. Do you think I'm going to leave her in prison? Or Sauverand either? There's not a second to lose, old chap." Mazeroux thought to himself that the chief had not quite recovered his wits yet. What? Release Marie Fauville and Sauverand, 1, 2, 3, just like that? No, it was going a bit too far. However, he took down to the Prefect's car a new Perenna, merry, brisk, and as fresh as though he had just got out of bed. "Very flattering to my pride," said Don Luis to Mazeroux. "Most flattering, that hesitation of the Prefect's. After I had warned him over the telephone, followed by his submission at the decisive moment. What a hold I must have on all those jokers, to make them sit up at a sign from little me! Beware, gentlemen! I telephoned to them from the bottomless pit. Beware! At 3 o'clock, a bomb! Nonsense, say they. Not a bit of it, say I. How do you know? Because I do. But what proof have you? What proof? That I say so. Oh, well, of course, if you say so. And at 5 minutes to 3, out they march. Ah, if I wasn't built up of modesty!" They came to the Boulevard Suchet, where the crowd was so dense that they had to alight from the car. Mazeroux passed through the cordon of police protecting the approaches to the house and took Don Luis to the slope across the road. "Wait for me here, Chief. I'll tell the Prefect of Police." On the other side of the boulevard, under the pale morning sky in which a few black clouds still lingered, Don Luis saw the havoc wrought by the explosion. It was apparently not so great as he had expected. Some of the ceilings had fallen in, and the rubbish showed through the yawning cavities of the windows. But the house remained standing. Even Fauville's built-out annex had not suffered overmuch; and, strange to say, the electric light, which the Prefect had left burning on his departure, had not gone out. The garden and the road were covered with stacks of furniture, over which a number of soldiers and police kept watch. "Come with me, Chief," said Mazeroux, as he fetched Don Luis and led him toward the engineer's workroom. A part of the floor was demolished. The outer walls on the left, near the passage, were cracked; and 2 workmen were fixing up beams, brought from the nearest timber yard, to support the ceiling. But on the whole the explosion had not had the results which the man who prepared it must have anticipated. M. Desmalions was there, together with all the men who had spent the night in the room, and several important persons from the public prosecutor's office. Weber, the deputy chief detective, alone had gone, refusing to meet his enemy. Don Luis's arrival caused great excitement. The Prefect at once came up to him and said: "All our thanks, Monsieur. Your insight is above praise. You have saved our lives, and these gentlemen and I wish to tell you so most emphatically. In my case, it is the second time that I have to thank you." "There is a very simple way of thanking me, Monsieur le Préfet," said Don Luis, "and that is to allow me to carry out my task to the end." "Your task?" "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. My action of last night is only the beginning. The conclusion is the release of Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand." M. Desmalions smiled. "Oh! Am I asking too much, Monsieur le Préfet?" "One can always ask, but the request should be reasonable; and the innocence of those people does not depend on me." "No, but it depends on you, Monsieur le Préfet, to let them know if I prove their innocence to you." "Yes, I agree, if you prove it beyond dispute." "Just so." Don Luis's calm assurance impressed M. Desmalions, in spite of everything, and even more than on the former occasions, and he suggested: "The results of the hasty inspection which we have made will perhaps help you. For instance, we are certain that the bomb was placed by the entrance to the passage, and probably under the boards of the floor." "Please do not trouble, Monsieur le Préfet. These are only secondary details. The great thing now is that you should know the whole truth, and that not only through words." The Prefect had come closer. The magistrate and detectives were standing round Don Luis, watching his lips and movements with feverish impatience. Was it possible that that truth, as yet so remote and vague, in spite of all the importance which they attached to the arrests already effected, was known at last? It was a solemn moment. Everyone was on tenterhooks. The manner in which Don Luis had foretold the explosion lent the value of an accomplished fact to his predictions; and the men whom he had saved from the terrible catastrophe were almost ready to accept as certainties the most improbable statements which a man of his stamp might make. "Monsieur le Préfet," he said, "you waited in vain last night for the 4th letter to make its appearance. We shall now be able, by an unexpected miracle of chance, to be present at the delivery of the letter. You will then know that it was the same hand that committed all the crimes, and you will know whose hand that was." And turning to Mazeroux: "Sergeant, will you please make the room as dark as you can? The shutters are gone, but you might draw the curtains across the windows and close the doors. Monsieur le Préfet, is it by accident that the electric light is on?" "Yes, by accident. We will have it turned out." "One moment. Have any of you gentlemen a pocket lantern about you? Or, no, it doesn't matter. This will do." There was a candle in a sconce. He took it and lit it. Then he switched off the electric light. There was a half darkness amid which the flame of the candle flickered in the draught from the windows. Don Luis protected the flame with his hand and moved to the table. "I do not think that we shall be kept waiting long," he said. "As I foresee it, there will be only a few seconds before the facts speak for themselves and better than I could do." Those few seconds, during which no one broke the silence, were unforgettable. M. Desmalions has since declared, in an interview in which he ridicules himself very cleverly, that his brain, overstimulated by the fatigues of the night and by the whole scene before him, imagined the most unlikely events, such as an invasion of the house by armed assailants, or the apparition of ghosts and spirits. He had the curiosity, however, he said, to watch Don Luis. Sitting on the edge of the table, with his head thrown a little back and his eyes roaming over the ceiling, Don Luis was eating a piece of bread and nibbling at a cake of chocolate. He seemed very hungry, but quite at his ease. The others maintained that tense attitude which we put on at moments of great physical effort, their faces distorted with a sort of grimace. They were haunted by the memory of the explosion, as well as obsessed by what was going to happen. The flame of the candle cast shadows on the wall. More seconds elapsed than Don Luis Perenna had said, 30 or 40 seconds perhaps, that seemed endless. Then Perenna lifted the candle a little and said: "There you are." They had all seen what they now saw almost as soon as he spoke. A letter was descending from the ceiling. It spun round slowly, like a leaf falling from a tree without being driven by the wind. It just touched Don Luis and alighted on the floor between two legs of the table. Picking up the paper and handing it to M. Desmalions, Don Luis said: "There you are, Monsieur le Préfet. This is the fourth letter, due last night." Chapter 14. Chapter 14, Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 14. The Hater. M. Desmalions looked at him without understanding, and looked from him to the ceiling. Perenna said: "Oh, there's no witchcraft about it, and though no one has thrown that letter from above, though there is not the smallest hole in the ceiling, the explanation is quite simple." "Quite simple, is it?" said M. Desmalions. "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. It all looks like an extremely complicated conjuring trick, done almost for fun. Well, I say that it is quite simple and at the same time terribly tragic. Sergeant Mazeroux, would you mind drawing back the curtains and giving us as much light as possible?" While Mazeroux was executing his orders, and M. Desmalions glancing at the fourth letter, the contents of which were unimportant and merely confirmed the previous ones, Don Luis took a pair of steps which the workman had left in the corner, set it up in the middle of the room, and climbed to the top, where, seated astride, he was able to reach the electric chandelier. It consisted of a broad circular band in brass, beneath which was a festoon of crystal pendants. Inside there were 3 lamps, placed at the corners of a brass triangle concealing the wires. He uncovered the wires and cut them. Then he began to take the whole fitting to pieces. To hasten matters, he asked for a hammer and broke up the plaster all round the clamps that held the chandelier in position. "Lend me a hand, please," he said to Mazeroux. Mazeroux went up the steps, and between them they took hold of the chandelier and let it slide down the uprights. The detectives caught it and placed it on the table with some difficulty, for it was much heavier than it looked. On inspection, it proved to be surmounted by a cubical metal box, measuring about 8 inches square, which box, being fastened inside the ceiling between the iron clamps, had obliged Don Luis to knock away the plaster that concealed it. "What the devil's this?" exclaimed M. Desmalions. "Open it for yourself, Monsieur le Préfet. There's a lid to it," said Perenna. M. Desmalions raised the lid. The box was filled with springs and wheels, a whole complicated and detailed mechanism resembling a piece of clockwork. "By your leave, Monsieur le Préfet," said Don Luis. He took out one piece of machinery and discovered another beneath it, joined to the first by the gearing of 2 wheels. And the second was more like one of those automatic apparatuses which turn out printed slips. Right at the bottom of the box, just where the box touched the ceiling, was a semicircular groove, and at the edge of it was a letter ready for delivery. "The last of the 5 letters," said Don Luis, doubtless continuing the series of denunciations. "You will notice, Monsieur le Préfet, that the chandelier originally had a 4th lamp in the centre. It was obviously removed when the chandelier was altered, so as to make room for the letters to pass." He continued his detailed explanations. "So the whole set of letters was placed here at the bottom. A clever piece of machinery, controlled by clockwork, took them one by one at the appointed time, pushed them to the edge of the groove concealed between the lamps and the pendants, and projected them into space. None of those standing around Don Luis spoke, and all of them seemed perhaps a little disappointed. The whole thing was certainly very clever, but they had expected something better than a trick of springs and wheels, however surprising. "Have patience, gentlemen," said Don Luis. "I promised you something ghastly, and you shall have it." "Well, I agree," said the Prefect of Police, "that this is where the letters started from, but a good many points remain obscure, and apart from this, there is one fact in particular which it seems impossible to understand. How were the criminals able to adapt the chandelier in this way? And in a house guarded by the police, in a room watched night and day, how were they able to carry out such a piece of work without being seen or heard?" "The answer is quite easy, Monsieur le Préfet. The work was done before the house was guarded by the police." "Before the murder was committed, therefore?" "Before the murder was committed." "And what is to prove to me that that is so?" "You have said so yourself, Monsieur le Préfet, because it could not have been otherwise." "But do explain yourself, Monsieur," cried M. Desmalions, with a gesture of irritation. "If you have important things to tell us, why delay?" "It is better, Monsieur le Préfet, that you should arrive at the truth in the same way as I did. When you know the secret of the letters, the truth is much nearer than you think. And you would have already named the criminal if the horror of his crime had not been so great as to divert all suspicion from him." M. Desmalions looked at him attentively. He felt the importance of Perenna's every word, and he was really anxious. "Then, according to you," he said, "those letters accusing Mme. Fauville and Gaston Sauverand were placed there with the sole object of ruining both of them?" "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet." "And, as they were placed there before the crime, the plot must have been schemed before the murder?" "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet, before the murder. From the moment that we admit the innocence of Mme. Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, we are obliged to conclude that, as everything accuses them, this is due to a series of deliberate acts. Mme. Fauville was out on the night of the murder. A plot. She was unable to say how she spent her time while the murder was being committed. A plot. Her inexplicable drive in the direction of La Muette and her cousin Sauverand's walk in the neighbourhood of the house. Plots. The marks left in the apple by those teeth, by Mme. Fauville's own teeth. A plot, and the most infernal of all. I tell you, everything is plotted beforehand. Everything is, so to speak, prepared, measured out, labelled and numbered. Everything takes place at the appointed time. Nothing is left to chance. It is a work very nicely pieced together, worthy of the most skillful artisan, so solidly constructed that outside happenings have not been able to throw it out of gear. And that the scheme works exactly, precisely, imperturbably like the clockwork in this box, which is a perfect symbol of the whole business and at the same time gives a most accurate explanation of it, because the letters denouncing the murderers were duly posted before the crime and delivered after the crime on the dates and at the hours foreseen." M. Desmalions remained thinking for a time and then objected: "Still, in the letters which he wrote, M. Fauville accuses his wife." "He does? We must therefore admit either that he was right in accusing her or that the letters are forged." "They are not forged. All the experts have recognized M. Fauville's handwriting." Then... Don Luis did not finish his sentence, and M. Desmalions felt the breath of the truth fluttering still nearer round him. The others, one and all as anxious as himself, were silent. He muttered: "I do not understand." "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet, you do. You understand that, if the sending of those letters forms an integrate part of the plot hatched against Mme. Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, it is because their contents were prepared in such a way as to be the undoing of the victims." "What? What are you saying?" "I am saying what I said before. Once they are innocent, everything that tells against them is part of the plot." Again there was a long silence. The Prefect of Police did not conceal his agitation. Speaking very slowly, with his eyes fixed on Don Luis's eyes, he said: "Whoever the culprit may be, I know nothing more terrible than this work of hatred." "It is an even more improbable work than you can imagine, Monsieur le Préfet," said Perenna with growing animation. "And it is a hatred of which you, who do not know Sauverand's confession, cannot yet estimate the violence. I understood it completely as I listened to the man. And since then all my thoughts have been overpowered by the dominant idea of that hatred. Who could hate like that? To whose loathing had Marie Fauville and Sauverand been sacrificed? Who was the inconceivable person whose perverted genius had surrounded his two victims with chains so powerfully forged? And another idea came to my mind, an earlier idea which had already struck me several times and to which I have already referred in Sergeant Mazeroux's presence. I mean the really mathematical character of the appearance of the letters. I said to myself that such grave documents could not be introduced into the case at fixed dates, unless some primary reason demanded that those dates should absolutely be fixed. What reason? If a human agency had been at work each time, there would surely have been some irregularity dependent on this, especially after the police had become cognizant of the matter and were present at the delivery of the letters. Well, Perenna continued, in spite of every obstacle, the letters continued to come, as though they could not help it. And thus the reason of their coming gradually dawned upon me. They came mechanically, by some invisible process set going once and for all, and working with the blind certainty of a physical law. This was a case not of a conscious intelligence and will, but just of material necessity. It was the clash of these two ideas, the idea of the hatred pursuing the innocent and the idea of that machinery serving the schemes of the hater. It was their clash that gave birth to the little spark of light. When brought into contact, the two ideas combined in my mind and suggested the recollection that Hippolyte Fauville was an engineer by profession. The others listened to him with a sort of uneasy oppression. What was gradually being revealed of the tragedy, instead of relieving the anxiety, increased it until it became absolutely painful. M. Desmalions objected. "Granting that the letters arrived on the dates named, you will nevertheless have noted that the hour varied on each occasion." "That is to say, it varied according as we watched in the dark or not. And that is just the detail which supplied me with the key to the riddle. If the letters, and this was an indispensable precaution which we are now able to understand, were delivered only under cover of the darkness, it must be because a contrivance of some kind prevented them from appearing when the electric light was on, and because that contrivance was controlled by a switch inside the room. There is no other explanation possible. We have to do with an automatic distributor that delivers the incriminating letters which it contains by clockwork, releasing them only between this hour and that on such and such a night, fixed in advance, and only at times when the electric light is off. You have the apparatus before you. No doubt the experts will admire its ingenuity and confirm my assertions. But given the fact that it was found in the ceiling of this room, given the fact that it contained letters written by M. Fauville, am I not entitled to say that it was constructed by M. Fauville, the electrical engineer?" Once more the name of M. Fauville returned, like an obsession, and each time the name stood more clearly defined. It was first M. Fauville, then M. Fauville the engineer, then M. Fauville the electrical engineer. And thus the picture of the hater, as Don Luis said, appeared in its accurate outlines, giving those men, used though they were to the strangest criminal monstrosities, a thrill of terror. The truth was now no longer prowling around them. They were already fighting with it, as you fight with an adversary whom you do not see, but who clutches you by the throat and brings you to the ground. And the Prefect of Police, summing up all his impressions, said in a strained voice: "So Monsieur Fauville wrote those letters in order to ruin his wife and the man who was in love with her?" "Yes." "In that case, what? Knowing at the same time that he was threatened with death, he wished, if ever the threat was realized, that his death should be laid to the charge of his wife and her friend?" "Yes." "And in order to avenge himself on their love for each other, and to gratify his hatred of them both, he wanted the whole set of facts to point to them as guilty of the murder of which he would be the victim?" "Yes." So that M. Fauville, in one part of his accursed work, was, what shall I say, the accomplice of his own murder? He dreaded death, he struggled against it, but he arranged that his hatred should gain by it. That's it, isn't it? That's how it is?" "Almost, Monsieur le Préfet. You are following the same stages by which I travelled, and, like myself, you are hesitating before the last truth, before the truth which gives the tragedy its sinister character and deprives it of all human proportions." The Prefect struck the table with his two fists and, in a sudden fit of revolt, cried: "It's ridiculous! It's a perfectly preposterous theory! Monsieur Fauville threatened with death and contriving his wife's ruin with that Machiavellian perseverance! Absurd! The man who came to my office, the man whom you saw, was thinking of only one thing: how to escape dying. He was obsessed by one dread alone, the dread of death. It is not at such moments," the Prefect emphasized, "that a man fits up clockwork and lays traps, especially when those traps cannot take effect unless he dies by foul play.
Can you see M. Fauville working at his automatic machine, putting in with his own hands letters which he has taken the pains to write to a friend 3 months before and intercept, arranging events so that his wife shall appear guilty and saying, 'There, if I die murdered, I'm easy in my mind. The person to be arrested will be Marie'? No, you must confess, men don't take these gruesome precautions. Or if they do, it means that they're sure of being murdered. It means that they agree to be murdered. It means that they are at one with the murderer, so to speak, and meet him halfway. In short, it means—" He interrupted himself, as if the sentences which he had spoken had surprised him. And the others seemed equally disconcerted. And all of them unconsciously drew from those sentences the conclusions which they implied, and which they themselves did not yet fully perceive. Don Luis did not remove his eyes from the Prefect, and awaited the inevitable words. M. Desmalions muttered: "Come, you're not going to suggest that he had agreed—" "I suggest nothing, Monsieur le Préfet," said Don Luis. "So far you had followed the logical and natural trend of your thoughts; and that brings you to your present position." Yes, I know, but I'm showing you the absurdity of your theory. It can't be correct, and we can't believe in Marie Fauville's innocence unless we are prepared to suppose an unheard of thing, that M. Fauville took part in his own murder. Why, it's laughable!" And he gave a laugh, but it was a forced laugh and did not ring true. "For after all," he added, "you can't deny that that is where we stand." "I don't deny it." "Well?" "Well, M. Fauville, as you say, took part in his own murder." This was said in the quietest possible fashion, with an air of such certainty that no one dreamed of protesting. After the work of deduction and supposition which Don Luis had compelled his hearers to undertake, they found themselves in a corner which it was impossible for them to leave without stumbling against unanswerable objections. There was no longer any doubt about M. Fauville's share in his own death. But of what did that share consist? What part had he played in the tragedy of hatred and murder? Had he played that part which ended in the sacrifice of his life, voluntarily or under compulsion? Who, when all was said and done, had served as his accomplice or his executioner? All these questions came crowding upon the minds of M. Desmalions and the others. They thought of nothing but of how to solve them, and Don Luis could feel certain that his solution was accepted beforehand. From that moment he had but to tell his story of what had happened without fear of contradiction. He did so briefly, after the manner of a succinct report limited to essentials. 3 months before the crime, M. Fauville wrote a series of letters to one of his friends, M. Langernault, who, as Sergeant Mazeroux will have told you, Monsieur le Préfet, had been dead for several years, a fact of which M. Fauville cannot have been ignorant. These letters were posted, but were intercepted by some means which it is not necessary that we should know for the moment. M. Fauville erased the postmarks and the addresses and inserted the letters in a machine constructed for the purpose, of which he regulated the works so that the first letter should be delivered a fortnight after his death, and the others at intervals of 10 days. At this moment, it is certain that his plan was concerted down to the smallest detail. Knowing that Sauverand was in love with his wife, watching Sauverand's movements, he must obviously have noticed that his detested rival used to pass under the windows of the house every Wednesday, and that Marie Fauville would go to her window. This is a fact of the first importance, one which was exceedingly valuable to me, and it will impress you as being equal to a material proof. Every Wednesday evening, I repeat, Sauverand used to wander round the house. Now note this. First, the crime prepared by M. Fauville was committed on a Wednesday evening. Secondly, it was at her husband's express request that Mme. Fauville went out that evening to go to the opera and to Mme. d'Ersinger's. Don Luis stopped for a few seconds and then continued. Consequently, on the morning of that Wednesday, everything was ready. The fatal clock was wound up, the incriminating machinery was working to perfection, and the proofs to come would confirm the immediate proofs which M. Fauville held in reserve. Better still, Monsieur le Préfet, you had received from him a letter in which he told you of the plot hatched against him, and he implored your assistance for the morning of the next day, that is to say, after his death. Everything, in short, led him to think that things would go according to the hater's wishes, when something occurred that nearly upset his schemes: the appearance of Inspector Vérot, who had been sent by you, Monsieur le Préfet, to collect particulars about the Mornington heirs. What happened between the two men? Probably no one will ever know. Both are dead, and their secret will not come to life again. But we can at least say for certain that Inspector Vérot was here and took away with him the cake of chocolate on which the teeth of the tiger were seen for the first time, and also that Inspector Vérot succeeded, thanks to circumstances with which we are unacquainted, in discovering M. Fauville's projects. This we know, explained Don Luis, because Inspector Vérot said so in his own agonizing words, because it was through him that we learned that the crime was to take place on the following night, and because he had set down his discoveries in a letter which was stolen from him. And Fauville knew it also, because to get rid of the formidable enemy who was thwarting his designs, he poisoned him. Because when the poison was slow in acting, he had the audacity, under a disguise which made him look like Sauverand, and which was one day to turn suspicion against Sauverand, he had the audacity and the presence of mind to follow Inspector Vérot to the Café du Pont Neuf, to purloin the letter of explanation which Inspector Vérot wrote you, to substitute a blank sheet of paper for it, and then to ask a passer-by, who might become a witness against Sauverand, the way to the nearest underground station for Neuilly, where Sauverand lived. There's your man, Monsieur le Préfet. End of chapter 14, part 1.
Chapter 14, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 14, The Hater. Don Luis spoke with increasing force, with the ardour that springs from conviction, and his logical and closely argued speech seemed to conjure up the actual truth. "There's your man, Monsieur le Préfet," he repeated. "There's your scoundrel." And the situation in which he found himself was such, the fear inspired by Inspector Vérot's possible revelations was such that, before putting into execution the horrible deed which he had planned, he came to the police office to make sure that his victim was no longer alive and had not been able to denounce him. You remember the scene, Monsieur le Préfet, the fellow's agitation and fright. "To-morrow evening," he said. Yes, it was for the morrow that he asked for your help, because he knew that everything would be over that same evening and that next day the police would be confronted with a murder, with the two culprits against whom he himself had heaped up the charges, with Marie Fauville, whom he had, so to speak, accused in advance. That was why Sergeant Mazeroux's visit and mine to his house at 9 o'clock in the evening embarrassed him so obviously. Who were these intruders? Would they not succeed in shattering his plan? Reflection reassured him, even as we, by our insistence, compelled him to give way. After all, what did he care? Asked Perenna. His measures were so well taken that no amount of watching could destroy them or even make the watchers aware of them. What was to happen would happen in our presence and unknown to us. Death, summoned by him, would do its work. And the tragedy rather, ran its course. Madame Fauville, whom he was sending to the opera, came to say good night. Then his servant brought him something to eat, including a dish of apples. Then followed a fit of rage, the agony of the man who is about to die and who fears death, and a whole scene of deceit, in which he showed us his safe and the drab cloth diary which was supposed to contain the story of the plot. That ended matters. Mazeroux and I retired to the hall passage, closing the door after us. And M. Fauville remained alone and free to act. Nothing now could prevent the fulfilment of his wishes. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Madame Fauville, to whom, no doubt, in the course of the day, imitating Sauverand's handwriting, he had sent a letter, one of those letters which are always torn up at once, in which Sauverand entreated the poor woman to grant him an interview at the Ranelagh, Madame Fauville would leave the opera and, before going to Mme. d'Ersinger's party, would spend an hour not far from the house. On the other hand, Sauverand would be performing his usual Wednesday pilgrimage less than half a mile away, in the opposite direction. During this time, the crime would be committed. Both of them would come under the notice of the police, either by M. Fauville's allusions or by the incident at the Café du Pont Neuf. Both of them, moreover, would be incapable either of providing an alibi or of explaining their presence so near the house. Were not both of them bound to be accused and convicted of the crime? In the most unlikely event that some chance should protect them, there was an undeniable proof lying ready to hand in the shape of the apple containing the very marks of Mme. Fauville's teeth. And then, a few weeks later, the last and decisive trick, the mysterious arrival at intervals of 10 days of the letters denouncing the pair. So everything was settled. The smallest details were foreseen with infernal clearness. You remember, Monsieur le Préfet, that turquoise which dropped out of my ring and was found in the safe? There were only 4 persons who could have seen it and picked it up. M. Fauville was one of them. Well, he was just the one whom we all accepted. And yet it was he who, to cast suspicion upon me and to forestall an interference which he felt would be dangerous, seized the opportunity and placed the turquoise in the safe. This time the work was completed. Fate was about to be fulfilled. Between the hater and his victims there was but the distance of 1 act. The act was performed. M. Fauville died. Don Luis ceased. His words were followed by a long silence, and he felt certain that the extraordinary story which he had just finished telling met with the absolute approval of his hearers. They did not discuss, they believed. And yet it was the most incredible truth that he was asking them to believe. M. Desmalions asked one last question. "You were in that passage with Sergeant Mazeroux. There were detectives outside the house. Admitting that M. Fauville knew that he was to be killed that night and at that very hour of the night, who can have killed him and who can have killed his son? There was no one within these four walls." "There was M. Fauville." A sudden clamour of protests arose. The veil was promptly torn; and the spectacle revealed by Don Luis provoked, in addition to horror, an unforeseen outburst of incredulity and a sort of revolt against the too kindly attention which had been accorded to those explanations. The Prefect of Police expressed the general feeling by exclaiming: "Enough of words! Enough of theories! However logical they may seem, they lead to absurd conclusions." "Absurd in appearance, Monsieur le Préfet. But how do we know that M. Fauville's unheard of conduct is not explained by very natural reasons? Of course, no one dies with a light heart for the mere pleasure of revenge. But how do we know that M. Fauville, whose extreme emaciation and pallor you must have noted as I did, was not stricken by some mortal illness and that, knowing himself doomed—" "I repeat, enough of words!" cried the Prefect. "You go only by suppositions. What I want is proofs, a proof, only one, and we are still waiting for it." "Here it is, Monsieur le Préfet." "Eh? What's that you say?" "Monsieur le Préfet, when I removed the chandelier from the plaster that supported it, I found, outside the upper surface of the metal box, a sealed envelope. As the chandelier was placed under the attic occupied by M. Fauville's son, it is evident that M. Fauville was able, by lifting the boards of the floor in his son's room, to reach the top of the machine which he had contrived. This was how, during that last night, he placed this sealed envelope in position, after writing on it the date of the murder, 31 March, 11 P.M., and his signature, Hippolyte Fauville." M. Desmalions opened the envelope with an eager hand. His first glance at the pages of writing which it contained made him give a start. "Oh, the villain! The villain!" he said. "How is it possible for such a monster to exist? What a loathsome brute!" In a jerky voice, which became almost inaudible at times, owing to his amazement, he read: "The end is reached. My hour is striking. Put to sleep by me, Edmond is dead without having been roused from his unconsciousness by the fire of the poison. My own death agony is beginning. I am suffering all the tortures of hell. My hand can hardly write these last lines. I suffer, how I suffer! And yet my happiness is unspeakable. This happiness dates back to my visit to London with Edmond 4 months ago. Until then, I was dragging on the most hideous existence, hiding my hatred of the woman who detested me and who loved another, broken down in health, feeling myself already eaten up with an unrelenting disease, and seeing my son grow daily more weak and languid. In the afternoon, I consulted a great physician, and I no longer had the least doubt left. The malady that was eating into me was cancer. And I knew besides that, like myself, my son Edmond was on the road to the grave, incurably stricken with consumption. That same evening I conceived the magnificent idea of revenge, and such a revenge! The most dreadful accusations made against a man and a woman in love with each other. Prison. The assizes. Penal servitude. The scaffold. And no assistance possible, not a struggle, not a hope. Accumulated proofs, proofs so formidable as to make the innocent themselves doubt their own innocence and remain hopelessly and helplessly dumb. What a revenge! And what a punishment, to be innocent and to struggle vainly against the very facts that accuse you, the very certainty that proclaims you guilty. And I prepared everything with a glad heart. Each happy thought, each invention made me shout with laughter. Lord, how merry I was! You would think that cancer hurts not a bit of it. How can you suffer physical pain when your soul is quivering with delight? Do you think I feel the hideous burning of the poison at this moment? I am happy. The death which I have inflicted on myself is the beginning of their torment. Then why live and wait for a natural death which to them would mean the beginning of their happiness? And as Edmond had to die, why not save him a lingering illness and give him a death which would double the crime of Marie and Sauverand? The end is coming. I had to break off. The pain was too much for me. Now to pull myself together. How silent everything is! Outside the house and in the house are emissaries of the police watching over my crime. At no great distance, Marie, in obedience to my letter, is hurrying to the trysting place, where her beloved will not come, and the beloved is roaming under the windows where his darling will not appear. Oh, the dear little puppets whose string I pull! Dance, jump, skip. Lord, what fun they are! A rope round your neck, sir, and, madam, a rope round yours. Was it not you, sir, who poisoned Inspector Vérot this morning, and followed him to the Café du Pont Neuf with your grand ebony walking stick? Why, of course it was. And at night the pretty lady poisons me and poisons her stepson. Prove it? Well, what about this apple, madame, this apple, which you did not bite into, and which all the same will be found to bear the marks of your teeth? What fun! Dance, jump, skip. And the letters, the trick of my letters to the late lamented Langernault, that was my crowning triumph. Oh, the joy of it when I invented and constructed my little mechanical toy! Wasn't it nicely thought out? Isn't it wonderfully neat and accurate? On the appointed day, click the first letter, and 10 days after, click the second letter. Come, there's no hope for you, my poor friends. You're nicely done for. Dance, jump, skip. And what amuses me, for I am laughing now, is to think that nobody will know what to make of it. Marie and Sauverand guilty, of that there is not the least doubt, but outside that, absolute mystery. Nobody will know, nor ever will know anything. In a few weeks' time, when the two criminals are irrevocably doomed, when the letters are in the hands of the police on the 25th, or rather at 3 o'clock on the morning of the 26th of May, an explosion will destroy every trace of my work. The bomb is in its place. A movement entirely independent of the chandelier will explode it at the hour aforesaid. I have just laid beside it the drab cloth manuscript book, in which I pretended that I wrote my diary, the phials containing the poison, the needles which I used, an ebony walking stick, 2 letters from Inspector Vérot, in short, anything that might save the culprits. Then how can any one know? No, nobody will know, nor ever will know anything, unless some miracle happens, unless the bomb leaves the walls standing and the ceiling intact, unless by some marvel of intelligence and intuition a man of genius, unravelling the threads which I have tangled, should penetrate to the very heart of the riddle and succeed, after a search lasting for months and months, in discovering this final letter. It is for this man that I write, well knowing that he cannot exist. But, after all, what do I care? Marie and Sauverand will be at the bottom of the abyss by then, dead no doubt, or in any case separated for ever, and I risk nothing by leaving this evidence of my hatred in the hands of chance. There, that's finished. I have only to sign. My hand shakes more and more. The sweat is pouring from my forehead in great drops. I am suffering the tortures of the damned, and I am divinely happy. Ah, my friends, you were waiting for my death. You, Marie, imprudently let me read in your eyes, which watched me stealthily, all your delight at seeing me so ill, and you were both of you so sure of the future that you had the courage to wait patiently for my death. Well, here it is, my death. Here it is, and there are you, united above my grave, linked together with the handcuffs. Marie, be the wife of my friend Sauverand. Sauverand, I bestow my spouse upon you. Be joined together in holy matrimony. Bless you, my children. The examining magistrate will draw up the contract, and the executioner will read the marriage service. Oh, the delight of it! I suffer agonies, but oh, the delight! What a fine thing is hatred, when it makes death a joy! I am happy in dying. Marie is in prison. Sauverand is weeping in the condemned man's cell. The door opens.
Oh, horror! The men in black, they walk up to the bed. Gaston Sauverand, your appeal is rejected. Courage! Be a man. Oh, the cold, dark morning, the scaffold! It's your turn, Marie, your turn. Would you survive your lover? Sauverand is dead. It's your turn. See, here's a rope for you. Or would you rather have poison? Die, will you, you hussy? Die with your veins on fire, as I am doing, I who hate you, hate you, hate you." M. Desmalions ceased, amid the silent astonishment of all those present. He had great difficulty in reading the concluding lines, the writing having become almost wholly shapeless and illegible. He said in a low voice, as he stared at the paper: "Hippolyte Fauville." "The signature is there." The scoundrel found a last remnant of strength to sign his name clearly. He feared that a doubt might be entertained of his villainy. And indeed, how could any one have suspected it? And looking at Don Luis, he added: "It needed, to solve the mystery, a really exceptional power of insight and gifts to which we must all do homage, to which I do homage. All the explanations which that madman gave have been anticipated in the most accurate and bewildering fashion." Don Luis bowed, and, without replying to the praise bestowed upon him, said: "You are right, Monsieur le Préfet. He was a madman, and one of the most dangerous kind, the lucid madman who pursues an idea from which nothing will make him turn aside. He pursued it with superhuman tenacity and with all the resources of his fastidious mind, enslaved by the laws of mechanics. Another would have killed his victims frankly and brutally. He set his wits to work to kill at a long date, like an experimenter who leaves to time the duty of proving the excellence of his invention. And he succeeded only too well, because the police fell into the trap and because Mme. Fauville is perhaps going to die." M. Desmalions made a gesture of decision. The whole business, in fact, was past history, on which the police proceedings would throw the necessary light. One fact alone was of importance to the present: the saving of Marie Fauville's life. "It's true," he said. "We have not a minute to lose. Mme. Fauville must be told without delay. At the same time, I will send for the examining magistrate; and the case against her is sure to be dismissed at once." He swiftly gave orders for continuing the investigations and verifying Don Luis's theories. Then, turning to Perenna: "Come, monsieur," he said. "It is right that Mme. Fauville should thank her rescuer. Mazeroux, you come too." The meeting was over, that meeting in the course of which Don Luis had given the most striking proofs of his genius. Waging war, so to speak, upon the powers beyond the grave, he had forced the dead man to reveal his secret. He disclosed, as though he had been present throughout, the hateful vengeance conceived in the darkness and carried out in the tomb. M. Desmalions showed all his admiration by his silence and by certain movements of his head. And Perenna took a keen enjoyment in the strange fact that he, who was being hunted down by the police a few hours ago, should now be sitting in a motor car beside the head of that same force. Nothing threw into greater relief the masterly manner in which he had conducted the business and the importance which the police attached to the results obtained. The value of his collaboration was such that they were willing to forget the incidents of the last 2 days. The grudge which Weber bore him was now of no avail against Don Luis Perenna. M. Desmalions, meanwhile, began briefly to review the new solutions, and he concluded by still discussing certain points. "Yes, that's it. There is not the least shadow of a doubt. We agree. It's that and nothing else. Still, 1 or 2 things remain obscure. First of all, the mark of the teeth. This, notwithstanding the husband's admission, is a fact which we cannot neglect." "I believe that the explanation is a very simple one, Monsieur le Préfet. I will give it to you as soon as I am able to support it with the necessary proofs." "Very well. But another question. How is it that Weber, yesterday morning, found that sheet of paper relating to the explosion in Mlle. Levasseur's room?" "And how was it," added Don Luis, laughing, "that I found there the list of the 5 dates corresponding with the delivery of the letters?" "So you are of my opinion," said M. Desmalions. "The part played by Mlle. Levasseur is at least suspicious." "I believe that everything will be cleared up, Monsieur le Préfet, and that you need now only question Mme. Fauville and Gaston Sauverand in order to dispel these last obscurities and remove all suspicion from Mlle. Levasseur." "And then," insisted M. Desmalions, "there is one more fact that strikes me as odd. Hippolyte Fauville does not once mention the Mornington inheritance in his confession. Why? Did he not know of it? Are we to suppose that there is no connection, beyond a mere casual coincidence, between the series of crimes and that bequest? There I am entirely of your opinion, Monsieur le Préfet. Hippolyte Fauville's silence as to that bequest perplexes me a little, I confess. But all the same, I look upon it as comparatively unimportant. The main thing is Fauville's guilt and the prisoner's innocence." Don Luis's delight was pure and unbounded. From his point of view, the sinister tragedy was at an end with the discovery of the confession written by Hippolyte Fauville. Anything not explained in those lines would be explained by the details to be supplied by Mme. Fauville, Florence Levasseur, and Gaston Sauverand. He himself had lost all interest in the matter. The car drew up at Saint Lazare, the wretched, sordid old prison which is still waiting to be pulled down. The Prefect jumped out. The door was opened at once. "Is the prison governor there?" he asked. "Quick, send for him. It's urgent." Then, unable to wait, he at once hastened toward the corridors leading to the infirmary and, as he reached the first floor landing, came up against the governor himself. "Mme. Fauville," he said without waste of time, "I want to see her." But he stopped short when he saw the expression of consternation on the prison governor's face. "Well, what is it?" he asked. "What's the matter?" "Why, haven't you heard, Monsieur le Préfet?" stammered the governor. "I telephoned to the office, you know." "Speak! What is it?" "Mme. Fauville died this morning. She managed somehow to take poison." M. Desmalions seized the governor by the arm and ran to the infirmary, followed by Perenna and Mazeroux. He saw Marie Fauville lying on a bed in one of the rooms. Her pale face and her shoulders were stained with brown patches, similar to those which had marked the bodies of Inspector Vérot, Hippolyte Fauville, and his son Edmond. Greatly upset, the Prefect murmured: "But the poison, where did it come from?" "This phial and syringe were found under her pillow, Monsieur le Préfet." "Under her pillow? But how did they get there? How did they reach her? Who gave them to her?" "We don't know yet, Monsieur le Préfet." M. Desmalions looked at Don Luis. So Hippolyte Fauville's suicide had not put an end to the series of crimes. His action had done more than aim at Marie's death by the hand of the law. It had now driven her to take poison. Was it possible? Was it admissible that the dead man's revenge should still continue in the same automatic and anonymous manner? Or rather, was there not some other mysterious will which was secretly and as audaciously carrying on Hippolyte Fauville's diabolical work? 2 days later came a fresh sensation. Gaston Sauverand was found dying in his cell. He had had the courage to strangle himself with his bedsheet. All efforts to restore him to life were vain. On the table near him lay a half dozen newspaper cuttings, which had been passed to him by an unknown hand. All of them told the news of Marie Fauville's death. Chapter 15 Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 15 The Heir to the 100 Millions. On the fourth evening after the tragic events related, an old cab driver, almost entirely hidden in a huge greatcoat, rang at Perenna's door and sent up a letter to Don Luis. He was at once shown into the study on the first floor. Hardly taking time to throw off his greatcoat, he rushed at Don Luis. "It's all up with you this time, Chief," he exclaimed. "This is no moment for joking. Pack up your trunks and be off as quick as you can." Don Luis, who sat quietly smoking in an easy chair, answered: "Which shall you have, Mazeroux? A cigar or a cigarette?" Mazeroux at once grew indignant. "But look here, Chief, don't you read the papers?" "Worse luck." "In that case, the situation must appear as clear to you as it does to me and everybody else. During the last 3 days, since the double suicide, or rather the double murder of Marie Fauville and her cousin Gaston Sauverand, there hasn't been a newspaper but has said this kind of thing. And now that M. Fauville, his son, his wife, and his cousin Gaston Sauverand are dead, there's nothing standing between Don Luis Perenna and the Mornington inheritance. Do you understand what that means? Of course, people speak of the explosion on the Boulevard Suchet and of Fauville's posthumous revelations, and they're disgusted with that dirty brute of a Fauville, and they don't know how to praise your cleverness enough. But there is one fact that forms the main subject of every conversation and every discussion. Now that the 3 branches of the Roussel family are extinct, who remains? Don Luis Perenna. In default of the natural heirs, who inherits the property? Don Luis Perenna." "Lucky dog!" "That's what people are saying, Chief. They say that this series of murders and atrocities cannot be the effort of chance coincidences, but, on the contrary, points to the existence of an all powerful will which began with the murder of Cosmo Mornington and ended with the capture of the 100 millions. And to give a name to that will, they pitch on the nearest, that of the extraordinary, glorious, ill-famed, bewildering, mysterious, omnipotent, and ubiquitous person who was Cosmo Mornington's intimate friend, and who from the beginning has controlled events and pieced them together, accusing and acquitting people, getting them arrested and helping them to escape. They say," he went on hurriedly, "that he manages the whole business and that, if he works it in accordance with his interests, there are 100 millions waiting for him at the finish. And this person is Don Luis Perenna, in other words, Arsène Lupin, the man with the unsavoury reputation whom it would be madness not to think of in connection with so colossal a job." "Thank you." "That's what they say, Chief. I'm only telling you. As long as Mme. Fauville and Gaston Sauverand were alive, people did not give much thought to your claims as residuary legatee. But both of them died. Then, you see, people can't help remarking the really surprising persistence with which luck looks after Don Luis Perenna's interests. You know the legal maxim, fecit cui prodest. Who benefits by the disappearance of all the Roussel heirs? Don Luis Perenna." "The scoundrel!" "The scoundrel! That's the word which Weber goes roaring out all along the passages of the police office and the criminal investigation department. You are the scoundrel and Florence Levasseur is your accomplice, and hardly any one dares protest. The Prefect of Police, what is the use of his defending you, of his remembering that you have saved his life twice over and rendered invaluable services to the police, which he is the first to appreciate? What is the use of his going to the Prime Minister, though we all know that Valenglay protects you? There are others besides the Prefect of Police. There are others besides the Prime Minister. There's the whole of the detective office. There's the public prosecutor's staff. There's the examining magistrate, the press, and, above all, public opinion, which has to be satisfied and which calls for and expects a culprit. That culprit is yourself or Florence Levasseur. Or rather, it's you and Florence Levasseur." Don Luis did not move a muscle of his face. Mazeroux waited a moment longer. Then, receiving no reply, he made a gesture of despair. "Chief, do you know what you are compelling me to do? To betray my duty. Well, let me tell you this. To morrow morning you will receive a summons to appear before the examining magistrate. At the end of your examination, whatever questions may have been put to you and whatever you may have answered, you will be taken straight to the lockup. The warrant is signed. That is what your enemies have done." "The devil!" "And that's not all. Weber, who is burning to take his revenge, has asked for permission to watch your house from this day onward, so that you may not slip away as Florence Levasseur did. He will be here with his men in an hour's time. What do you say to that, Chief?" Without abandoning his careless attitude, Don Luis beckoned to Mazeroux. "Sergeant, just look under that sofa between the windows." Don Luis was serious. Mazeroux instinctively obeyed. Under the sofa was a portmanteau. "Sergeant, in 10 minutes, when I have told my servants to go to bed, carry the portmanteau to 143 bis Rue de Rivoli, where I have taken a small flat under the name of Monsieur Lecoq." "What for, Chief? What does it mean?" "It means that, having no trustworthy person to carry that portmanteau for me, I have been waiting for your visit for the last 3 days." "Why, but," stammered Mazeroux in his confusion. "Why, but what? Had you made up your mind to clear out?" "Of course I had. But why hurry? The reason I placed you in the detective office was that I might know what was being plotted against me. Since you tell me that I am in danger, I shall cut my stick." And as Mazeroux looked at him with increasing bewilderment, he tapped him on the shoulder and said severely: "You see, Sergeant, that it was not worth while to disguise yourself as a cab driver and betray your duty. You should never betray your duty, Sergeant. Ask your own conscience. I am sure that it will judge you according to your deserts." Don Luis had spoken the truth. Recognizing how greatly the deaths of Marie Fauville and Sauverand had altered the situation, he considered it wise to move to a place of safety. His excuse for not doing so before was that he hoped to receive news of Florence Levasseur either by letter or by telephone. As the girl persisted in keeping silence, there was no reason why Don Luis should risk an arrest which the course of events made extremely probable. And, in fact, his anticipations were correct. Next morning, Mazeroux came to the little flat in the Rue de Rivoli, looking very spry. "You've had a narrow escape, Chief. Weber heard this morning that the bird had flown. He's simply furious. And you must confess that the tangle is getting worse and worse. They're utterly at a loss at headquarters. They don't even know how to set about prosecuting Florence Levasseur. You must have read about it in the papers. The examining magistrate maintains that, as Fauville committed suicide and killed his son Edmond, Florence Levasseur has nothing to do with the matter. In his opinion, the case is closed on that side. Well, he's a good one, the examining magistrate. What about Gaston Sauverand's death? Isn't it as clear as daylight that Florence had a hand in it as well as in all the rest? Wasn't it in her room, in a volume of Shakespeare, that documents were found relating to M. Fauville's arrangements about the letters and the explosion? And then—" Mazeroux interrupted himself, frightened by the look in Don Luis's eyes and realizing that the chief was fonder of the girl than ever. Guilty or not, she inspired him with the same passion. "All right," said Mazeroux. "We'll say no more about it. The future will bear me out, you'll see." The days passed.
Mazeroux called as often as possible, or else telephoned to Don Luis all the details of the two inquiries that were being pursued at Saint Lazare and at the Santé prison. Vain inquiries, as we know. While Don Luis's statements relating to the electric chandelier and the automatic distribution of the mysterious letters were found to be correct, the investigation failed to reveal anything about the two suicides. At most, it was ascertained that, before his arrest, Sauverand had tried to enter into correspondence with Marie through one of the tradesmen supplying the infirmary. Were they to suppose that the phial of poison and the hypodermic syringe had been introduced by the same means? It was impossible to prove. And, on the other hand, it was impossible to discover how the newspaper cuttings telling of Marie's suicide had found their way into Gaston Sauverand's cell. And then the original mystery still remained, the unfathomable mystery of the marks of teeth in the apple. M. Fauville's posthumous confession acquitted Marie. And yet it was undoubtedly Marie's teeth that had marked the apple. The teeth that had been called the teeth of the tiger were certainly hers. Well, then. In short, as Mazeroux said, everybody was groping in the dark, so much so that the Prefect, who was called upon by the will to assemble the Mornington heirs at a date not less than 3 nor more than 4 months after the testator's decease, suddenly decided that the meeting should take place in the course of the following week and fixed it for the 9th of June. He hoped in this way to put an end to an exasperating case in which the police displayed nothing but uncertainty and confusion. They would decide about the inheritance according to circumstances, and then close the proceedings. And gradually people would cease to talk about the wholesale slaughter of the Mornington heirs, and the mystery of the teeth of the tiger would be gradually forgotten. It was strange, but these last days, which were restless and feverish like all the days that come before great battles, and everyone felt that this last meeting meant a great battle, were spent by Don Luis in an armchair on his balcony in the Rue de Rivoli, where he sat quietly smoking cigarettes or blowing soap bubbles which the wind carried toward the garden of the Tuileries. Mazeroux could not get over it. "Chief, you astound me. How calm and careless you look." "I am calm and careless, Alexandre." "But what do you mean? Doesn't the case interest you? Don't you intend to avenge Mme. Fauville and Sauverand? You are openly accused, and you sit here blowing soap bubbles." "There's no more delightful pastime, Alexandre." "Shall I tell you what I think, Chief? You've discovered the solution of the mystery." "Perhaps I have, Alexandre, and perhaps I haven't." Nothing seemed to excite Don Luis. Hours and hours passed, and he did not stir from his balcony. The sparrows now came and ate the crumbs which he threw to them. It really seemed as if the case was coming to an end for him, and as if everything was turning out perfectly. But on the day of the meeting, Mazeroux entered with a letter in his hand and a scared look on his face. "This is for you, Chief. It was addressed to me, but with an envelope inside it in your name. How do you explain that?" "Quite easily, Alexandre. The enemy is aware of our cordial relations, and as he does not know where I am staying—" "What enemy?" "I'll tell you to morrow evening." Don Luis opened the envelope and read the following words, written in red ink: "There's still time, Lupin. Retire from the contest. If not, it means your death too. When you think that your object is attained, when your hand is raised against me and you utter words of triumph, at that same moment the ground will open beneath your feet. The place of your death is chosen. The snare is laid. Beware, Lupin." Don Luis smiled. "Good," he said. "Things are taking shape." "Do you think so, Chief?" "I do. And who gave you the letter?" "Ah, we've been lucky for once, Chief. The policeman to whom it was handed happened to live at Les Ternes, next door to the bearer of the letter. He knows the fellow well. It was a stroke of luck, wasn't it?" Don Luis sprang from his seat, radiant with delight. "What do you mean? Out with it! You know who it is?" "The chap's an indoor servant employed at a nursing home in the Avenue des Ternes." "Let's go there. We've no time to lose." "Splendid, Chief! You're yourself again." "Well, of course, as long as there was nothing to do, I was waiting for this evening and resting, for I can see that the fight will be tremendous. But as the enemy has blundered at last, as he's given me a trail to go upon, there's no need to wait, and I'll get ahead of him. Have at the tiger, Mazeroux." It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when Don Luis and Mazeroux arrived at the nursing home in the Avenue des Ternes. A manservant opened the door. Mazeroux nudged Don Luis. The man was doubtless the bearer of the letter. And in reply to the sergeant's questions, he made no difficulty about saying that he had been to the police office that morning. "By whose orders?" asked Mazeroux. "The Mother Superior's." "The Mother Superior?" "Yes, the home includes a private hospital which is managed by nuns." "Could we speak to the Superior?" "Certainly, but not now. She has gone out." "When will she be in?" "Oh, she may be back at any time." The man showed them into the waiting room, where they spent over an hour. They were greatly puzzled. What did the intervention of that nun mean? What part was she playing in the case?
People came in and were taken to the patients whom they had called to see. Others went out. There were also sisters moving silently to and fro, and nurses dressed in their long white overalls belted at the waist. "We're not doing any good here, Chief," whispered Mazeroux. "What's your hurry? Is your sweetheart waiting for you?" "We're wasting our time." "I'm not wasting mine. The meeting at the Prefect's is not till 5. "What did you say? You're joking, Chief. You surely don't intend to go to it?" "Why not?" "Why not? Well, the warrant." "The warrant? A scrap of paper." "A scrap of paper which will become a serious matter if you force the police to act. Your presence will be looked upon as a provocation." "And my absence as a confession. A gentleman who comes into 100 millions does not lie low on the day of the windfall. So I must attend that meeting, lest I should forfeit my claim. And attend it I will." "Chief!" A stifled cry was heard in front of them; and a woman, a nurse, who was passing through the room, at once started running, lifted a curtain, and disappeared. Don Luis rose, hesitating, not knowing what to do. Then, after 4 or 5 seconds of indecision, he suddenly rushed to the curtain and down a corridor, came up against a large leather padded door which had just closed, and wasted more time in stupidly fumbling at it with shaking hands. When he had opened it, he found himself at the foot of a back staircase. Should he go up it? On the right, the same staircase ran down to the basement. He went down it, entered a kitchen, and, seizing hold of the cook, said to her, in an angry voice: "Has a nurse just gone out this way?" "Do you mean Nurse Gertrude, the new one?" Yes, quick! She's wanted upstairs." "Who wants her?" "Oh, hang it all, can't you tell me which way she went?" "Through that door over there." Don Luis darted away, crossed a little hall, and rushed out on to the Avenue des Ternes. "Well, here's a pretty race!" cried Mazeroux, joining him. Don Luis stood scanning the avenue. A motor bus was starting on the little square hard by, the Place Saint Ferdinand. "She's inside it," he declared. "This time I shan't let her go." He hailed a taxi. "Follow that motor bus, driver, at 50 yards distance." "Is it Florence Levasseur?" asked Mazeroux. "Yes." "A nice thing!" growled the sergeant. And, yielding to a sudden outburst: "But look here, Chief, don't you see? Surely you're not as blind as all that." Don Luis made no reply. "But, Chief, Florence Levasseur's presence in the nursing home proves as clearly as ABC that it was she who told the manservant to bring me that threatening letter for you. There's not a doubt about it. Florence Levasseur is managing the whole business. You know it as well as I do. Confess. It's possible that during the last 10 days you've brought yourself for love of that woman to look upon her as innocent in spite of the overwhelming proofs against her. But today the truth hits you in the eye. I feel it. I am sure of it. Isn't it so, Chief? I'm right, am I not? You see it for yourself." This time Don Luis did not protest. With a drawn face and set eyes he watched the motor bus, which at that moment was standing still at the corner of the Boulevard Haussmann. "Stop!" he shouted to the driver. The girl alighted. It was easy to recognize Florence Levasseur under her nurse's uniform. She cast round her eyes as if to make sure that she was not being followed, and then took a cab and drove down the boulevard in the Rue de la Pépinière to the Gare Saint-Lazare. Don Luis saw her from a distance climbing the steps that run up from the Cour de Rome, and, on following her, caught sight of her again at the ticket office at the end of the waiting hall. "Quick, Mazeroux," he said. "Get out your detective card and ask the clerk what ticket she's taken. Run, before another passenger comes." Mazeroux hurried and questioned the ticket clerk and returned. "Second class for Rouen." "Take one for yourself." Mazeroux did so. They found that there was an express due to start in a minute. When they reached the platform, Florence was stepping into a compartment in the middle of the train. The engine whistled. "Get in," said Don Luis, hiding himself as best he could. "Telegraph to me from Rouen, and I'll join you this evening. Above all, keep your eyes on her. Don't let her slip between your fingers. She's very clever, you know." "But why don't you come yourself, Chief? It would be much better—" "Out of the question. The train doesn't stop before Rouen, and I couldn't be back till this evening. The meeting at the Prefect's is at 5 o'clock." "And you insist on going?" "More than ever. There, jump in." He pushed him into one of the end carriages. The train started and soon disappeared in the tunnel. Then Don Luis flung himself on a bench in a waiting room and remained there for 2 hours, pretending to read the newspapers. But his eyes wandered and his mind was haunted by the agonizing question that once more forced itself upon him: was Florence guilty or not? It was 5 o'clock exactly when Major Comte d'Astrignac, Maître Lepertuis, and the secretary of the American Embassy were shown into M. Desmalions's office. At the same moment some one entered the messenger's room and handed in his card. The messenger on duty glanced at the pasteboard, turned his head quickly toward a group of men talking in a corner, and then asked the newcomer: "Have you an appointment, sir?"
"It's not necessary. Just say that I'm here, Don Luis Perenna." Chapter 15, The Teeth of the Tiger. This recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 15. The Heir to the 100 Millions. A kind of electric shock ran through the little group in the corner, and one of the persons forming it came forward. It was Weber, the deputy chief detective. The two men looked each other straight in the eyes. Don Luis smiled amiably. Weber was livid. He shook in every limb and was plainly striving to contain himself. Near him stood a couple of journalists and 4 detectives. "By Jove, the beggars are there for me," thought Don Luis. "But their confusion shows that they did not believe that I should have the cheek to come. Are they going to arrest me?" Weber did not move, but in the end his face expressed a certain satisfaction, as though he were saying: "I've got you this time, my fine fellow, and you shan't escape me." The office messenger returned and, without a word, led the way for Don Luis. Perenna passed in front of Weber with the politest of bows, bestowed a friendly little nod on the detectives, and entered. The Comte d'Astrignac hurried up to him at once, with hands outstretched, thus showing that all the tittle-tattle in no way affected the esteem in which he continued to hold Private Perenna of the Foreign Legion. But the Prefect of Police maintained an attitude of reserve which was very significant. He went on turning over the papers which he was examining, and conversed in a low voice with the solicitor and the American Secretary of Embassy. Don Luis thought to himself: "My dear Lupin, there's some one going to leave this room with the bracelets on his wrists. If it's not the real culprit, it'll be you, my poor old chap." And he remembered the early part of the case, when he was in the workroom at the Fauvilles' house before the magistrates, and had either to deliver the criminal to justice or to incur the penalty of immediate arrest. In the same way, from the start to the finish of the struggle, he had been obliged, while fighting the invisible enemy, to expose himself to the attacks of the law, with no means of defending himself except by indispensable victories. Harassed by constant onslaughts, never out of danger, he had successively hurried to their deaths Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, 2 innocent people sacrificed to the cruel laws of war. Was he at last about to fight the real enemy, or would he himself succumb at the decisive moment? He rubbed his hands with such a cheerful gesture that M. Desmalions could not help looking at him. Don Luis wore the radiant air of a man who is experiencing a pure joy and who is preparing to taste others even greater. The Prefect of Police remained silent for a moment, as though asking himself what that devil of a fellow could be so pleased with. Then he fumbled through his papers once more and, in the end, said: "We have met again, gentlemen, as we did 2 months ago, to come to a definite conclusion about the Mornington inheritance. Signor Caceres, the attaché of the Peruvian legation, will not be here. I have received a telegram from Italy to tell me that Signor Caceres is seriously ill. However, his presence was not indispensable. There is no one lacking, therefore, except those, alas, whose claims this meeting would gladly have sanctioned, that is to say, Cosmo Mornington's heirs. There is one other person absent, Monsieur le Préfet." M. Desmalions looked up. The speaker was Don Luis. The Prefect hesitated and then decided to ask him to explain. "Whom do you mean? What person?" "The murderer of the Mornington heirs." This time again Don Luis compelled attention and, in spite of the resistance which he encountered, obliged the others to take notice of his presence and to yield to his ascendancy. Whatever happened, they had to listen to him. Whatever happened, they had to discuss with him things which seemed incredible, but which were possible because he put them into words. "Monsieur le Préfet," he asked, "will you allow me to set forth the facts of the matter as it now stands? They will form a natural sequel and conclusion of the interview which we had after the explosion on the Boulevard Suchet." M. Desmalions's silence gave Don Luis leave to speak. He at once continued: "It will not take long, Monsieur le Préfet. It will not take long for 2 reasons. First, because M. Fauville's confessions remain at our disposal and we know definitively the monstrous part which he played. And secondly, because, after all, the truth, however complicated it may seem, is really very simple. It all lies in the objection which you, Monsieur le Préfet, made to me on leaving the wrecked house on the Boulevard Suchet. How is it, you asked, that the Mornington inheritance is not once mentioned in Hippolyte Fauville's confession? It all lies in that, Monsieur le Préfet. Hippolyte Fauville did not say a word about the inheritance, and the reason, evidently, is that he did not know of it. And the reason why Gaston Sauverand was able to tell me his whole sensational story without making the least allusion to the inheritance was that the inheritance played no sort of part in Gaston Sauverand's story. He, too, knew nothing of it before those events, any more than Marie Fauville did, or Florence Levasseur.
There is no denying the fact. Hippolyte Fauville was guided by revenge and by revenge alone. If not, why should he have acted as he did, seeing that Cosmo Mornington's millions reverted to him by the fullest of rights? Besides, if he had wished to enjoy those millions, he would not have begun by killing himself. One thing, therefore, is certain. The inheritance in no way affected Hippolyte Fauville's resolves or actions. And nevertheless, one after the other, with inflexible regularity, as if they had been struck down in the very order called for by the terms of the Mornington inheritance, they all disappeared. Cosmo Mornington, then Hippolyte Fauville, then Edmond Fauville, then Marie Fauville, then Gaston Sauverand. First, the possessor of the fortune, next, all those whom he had appointed his legatees. And I repeat, in the very order in which the will enabled them to lay claim to the fortune. Is it not strange, asked Perenna, and are we not bound to suppose that there was a controlling mind at the back of it all? Are we not bound to admit that the formidable contest was influenced by that inheritance, and that above the hatred and jealousy of the loathsome Fauville there loomed a being endowed with even more tremendous energy, pursuing a tangible aim, and driving to their deaths, one by one, like so many numbered victims, all the unconscious actors in the tragedy of which he tied and of which he is now untying the threads? Don Luis leaned forward and continued earnestly: Monsieur le Préfet, the public instinct so thoroughly agrees with me. A section of the police, with M. Weber, the deputy chief detective at its head, argues in a manner so exactly identical with my own that the existence of that being is at once confirmed in every mind. There had to be some one to act as the controlling brain, to provide the will and the energy. That some one was myself. After all, why not? Did not I possess the condition which was indispensable to make any one interested in the murders? Was I not Cosmo Mornington's heir? I will not defend myself. It may be that outside interference, it may be that circumstances will oblige you, Monsieur le Préfet, to take unjustifiable measures against me. But I will not insult you by believing for 1 second that you can imagine the man whose acts you have been able to judge for the last 2 months capable of such crimes. And yet the public instinct is right in accusing me. Apart from Hippolyte Fauville, there is necessarily a criminal, and that criminal is necessarily Cosmo Mornington's heir. As I am not the man, another heir of Cosmo Mornington exists. It is he whom I accuse, Monsieur le Préfet. There is something more than a dead man's will in the wicked business that is being enacted before us. We thought for a time that there was only that. But there is something more. I have not been fighting a dead man all the time. More than once I have felt the very breath of life strike against my face. More than once I have felt the teeth of the tiger seeking to tear me. The dead man did much, but he did not do everything. And even then, was he alone in doing what he did? Was the being of whom I speak merely one who executed his orders? Or was he also the accomplice who helped him in his scheme? I do not know, but he certainly continued a work which he perhaps began by inspiring, and which, in any case, he turned to his own profit, resolutely completed and carried out to the very end. And he did so because he knew of Cosmo Mornington's will. It is he whom I accuse, Monsieur le Préfet. I accuse him at the very least of that part of the crimes and felonies which cannot be attributed to Hippolyte Fauville. I accuse him of breaking open the drawer of the desk in which Maître Lepertuis, Cosmo Mornington's solicitor, had put his client's will. I accuse him of entering Cosmo Mornington's room and substituting a phial containing a toxic fluid for one of the phials of glycerophosphate which Cosmo Mornington used for his hypodermic injections. I accuse him of playing the part of a doctor who came to certify Cosmo Mornington's death and of delivering a false certificate. I accuse him of supplying Hippolyte Fauville with the poison which killed successively Inspector Vérot, Edmond Fauville, and Hippolyte Fauville himself. I accuse him of arming and turning against me the hand of Gaston Sauverand, who, acting under his advice and his instructions, tried 3 times to take my life and ended by causing the death of my chauffeur. I accuse him of profiting by the relations which Gaston Sauverand had established with the infirmary in order to communicate with Marie Fauville, and of arranging for Marie Fauville to receive the hypodermic syringe and the phial of poison with which the poor woman was able to carry out her plans of suicide. Perenna paused to note the effect of these charges. Then he went on: I accuse him of conveying to Gaston Sauverand, by some unknown means, the newspaper cuttings about Marie Fauville's death, and at the same time foreseeing the inevitable results of his act. To sum up, therefore, without mentioning his share in the other crimes, the death of Inspector Vérot, the death of my chauffeur, I accuse him of killing Cosmo Mornington, Edmond Fauville, Hippolyte Fauville, Marie Fauville, and Gaston Sauverand. In plain words, of killing all those who stood between the millions and himself. These last words, Monsieur le Préfet, will tell you clearly what I have in my mind. When a man does away with 5 of his fellow creatures in order to secure a certain number of millions, It means that he is convinced that this proceeding will positively and mathematically ensure his entering into possession of the millions. In short, when a man does away with a millionaire and his four successive heirs, it means that he himself is the millionaire's fifth heir. The man will be here in a moment." "What?" It was a spontaneous exclamation on the part of the Prefect of Police, who was forgetting the whole of Don Luis Perenna's powerful and closely reasoned argument, and thinking only of the stupefying apparition which Don Luis announced. Don Luis replied: "Monsieur le Préfet, his visit is the logical outcome of my accusations. Remember that Cosmo Mornington's will explicitly states that no heir's claim will be valid unless he is present at today's meeting." "And suppose he does not come?" asked the Prefect, thus showing that Don Luis's conviction had gradually got the better of his doubts. "He will come, Monsieur le Préfet. If not, there would have been no sense in all this business. Limited to the crimes and other actions of Hippolyte Fauville, it could be looked upon as the preposterous work of a madman. Continued to the deaths of Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, it demands, as its inevitable outcome, the appearance of a person who, as the last descendant of the Roussels of Saint Etienne, and consequently as Cosmo Mornington's absolute heir, taking precedence of myself, will come to claim the 100 millions which he has won by means of his incredible audacity." "And suppose he does not come?" M. Desmalions once more exclaimed, in a more vehement tone. "Then, Monsieur le Préfet, you may take it that I am the culprit, and you have only to arrest me. This day, between 5 and 6 o'clock, you will see before you, in this room, the person who killed the Mornington heirs. It is, humanly speaking, impossible that this should not be so. Consequently, the law will be satisfied in any circumstances. He or I. The position is quite simple." M. Desmalions was silent. He gnawed his moustache thoughtfully and walked round and round the table, within the narrow circle formed by the others. It was obvious that objections to the supposition were springing up in his mind. In the end, he muttered, as though speaking to himself: "No, no. For, after all, how are we to explain that the man should have waited until now to claim his rights?" "An accident, perhaps, Monsieur le Préfet. An obstacle of some kind. Or else one can never tell the perverse longing for a more striking sensation. And remember, Monsieur le Préfet, how minutely and subtly the whole business was worked. Each event took place at the very moment fixed by Hippolyte Fauville. Cannot we take it that his accomplice is pursuing this method to the end and that he will not reveal himself until the last minute?" M. Desmalions exclaimed, with a sort of anger: "No, no, and again no! It is not possible. If a creature monstrous enough to commit such a series of murders exists, he will not be such a fool as to deliver himself into our hands." "Monsieur le Préfet, he does not know the danger that threatens him if he comes here, because no one has even contemplated the theory of his existence. Besides, what risk does he run?" "What risk? Why, if he has really committed those murders—" "He has committed them, Monsieur le Préfet. He has caused them to be committed, which is a different thing. And you now see where the man's unsuspected strength lies. He does not act in person. From the day when the truth appeared to me, I have succeeded in gradually discovering his means of action, in laying bare the machinery which he controls, the tricks which he employs. He does not act in person. There you have his method. You will find that it is the same throughout the series of murders. In appearance, Cosmo Mornington died of the results of a carelessly administered injection. In reality, it was this man who caused the injection to prove fatal. In appearance, Inspector Vérot was killed by Hippolyte Fauville. In reality, it must have been this man who contrived the murder by pointing out the necessity to Fauville and, so to speak, guiding his hand. And in the same way, in appearance, Fauville killed his son and committed suicide. Marie Fauville committed suicide. Gaston Sauverand committed suicide. In reality, it was this man who wanted them dead, who prompted them to commit suicide, and who supplied them with the means of death. There you have the method, and sure, Monsieur le Préfet, you have the man." And in a lower voice, that contained a sort of apprehension, he added: "I confess that never before, in the course of a life that has been full of strange meetings, have I encountered a more terrifying person, acting with more devilish ability or greater psychological insight." His words created an ever increasing sensation among his hearers. They really saw that invisible being. He took shape in their imaginations. They waited for him to arrive. Twice Don Luis had turned to the door and listened. And his action did more than anything else to conjure up the image of the man who was coming. M. Desmalions said: "Whether he acted in person or caused others to act, the law, once it has hold of him, will know how to—" "The law will find it no easy matter, Monsieur le Préfet. A man of his powers and resource must have foreseen everything, even his arrest, even the accusation of which he would be the subject. And there is little to be brought against him but moral charges without proofs." "Then you think—" "I think, Monsieur le Préfet, that the thing will be to accept his explanations as quite natural and not to show any distrust. What you want is to know who he is. Later on, before long, you will be able to unmask him." The Prefect of Police continued to walk round the table. Major d'Astrignac kept his eyes fixed on Perenna, whose coolness amazed him. The solicitor and the Secretary of Embassy seemed greatly excited. In fact, nothing could be more sensational than the thought that filled all their minds. Was the abominable murder about to appear before them? "Silence!" said the Prefect, stopping his walk. Some one had crossed the anteroom. There was a knock at the door. "Come in." The office messenger entered, carrying a card tray. On the tray was a letter; and, in addition, there was one of those printed slips on which callers write their name and the object of their visit. M. Desmalions hastened toward the messenger. He hesitated a moment before taking up the slip. He was very pale. Then he glanced at it quickly. "Oh!" he said, with a start. He looked toward Don Luis, reflected, and then, taking the letter, he said to the messenger: "Is the bearer outside?" "In the anteroom, Monsieur le Préfet." "Show the person in when I ring." The messenger left the room. M. Desmalions stood in front of his desk without moving. For the second time Don Luis met his eyes, and a feeling of perturbation came over him. What was happening? With a sharp movement the Prefect of Police opened the envelope which he held in his hand, unfolded the letter, and began to read it. The others watched his every gesture, watched the least change of expression on his face. Were Perenna's predictions about to be fulfilled? Was a fifth heir putting in his claim? The moment he had read the first lines, M. Desmalions looked up and, addressing Don Luis, murmured: "You are right, Monsieur. This is a claim." "On whose part, Monsieur le Préfet?" Don Luis could not help asking. M. Desmalions did not reply. He finished reading the letter. Then he read it again, with the attention of a man weighing every word. Lastly, he read aloud: "Monsieur le Préfet, a chance correspondence has revealed to me the existence of an unknown heir of the Roussel family. It was only to day that I was able to procure the documents necessary for identifying this heir; and, owing to unforeseen obstacles, it is only at the last moment that I am able to send them to you by the person whom they concern. Respecting a secret which is not mine, and wishing, as a woman, to remain outside a business in which I have been only accidentally involved, I beg you, Monsieur le Préfet, to excuse me if I do not feel called upon to sign my name to this letter." So Perenna had seen rightly, and events were justifying his forecast. Some one was putting in an appearance within the period indicated. The claim was made in good time; and the very way in which things were happening at the exact moment was curiously suggestive of the mechanical exactness that had governed the whole business. The last question still remained: who was this unknown person, the possible heir, and therefore the 5- or 6-fold murderer? He was waiting in the next room. There was nothing but a wall between him and the others. He was coming in. They would see him. They would know who he was. The Prefect suddenly rang the bell. A few tense seconds elapsed. Oddly enough, M. Desmalions did not remove his eyes from Perenna. Don Luis remained quite master of himself, but restless and uneasy at heart. The door opened. The messenger showed some one in. It was Florence Levasseur. Chapter 16.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 16. Weber takes his revenge. Don Luis was for one moment amazed. Florence Levasseur here! Florence, whom he had left in the train under Mazeroux's supervision, and for whom it was physically impossible to be back in Paris before 8 o'clock in the evening. Then, despite his bewilderment, he at once understood. Florence, knowing that she was being followed, had drawn them after her to the Gare Saint-Lazare and simply walked through the railway carriage, getting out on the other platform, while the worthy Mazeroux went on in the train to keep his eye on the traveller who was not there. But suddenly the full horror of the situation struck him. Florence was here to claim the inheritance; and her claim, as he himself had said, was a proof of the most terrible guilt. Acting on an irresistible impulse, Don Luis leapt to the girl's side, seized her by the arm, and said, with almost malevolent force: "What are you doing here? What have you come for? Why did you not let me know?" M. Desmalions stepped between them. But Don Luis, without letting go of the girl's arm, exclaimed: "Oh, Monsieur le Préfet, don't you see that this is all a mistake? The person whom we are expecting, about whom I told you, is not this one. The other is keeping in the background, as usual. Why, it's impossible that Florence Levasseur—" "I have no preconceived opinion on the subject of this young lady," said the Prefect of Police, in an authoritative voice. "But it is my duty to question her about the circumstances that brought her here, and I shall certainly do so." He released the girl from Don Luis's grasp and made her take a seat.
He himself sat down at his desk; and it was easy to see how great an impression the girl's presence made upon him. It afforded, so to speak, an illustration of Don Luis's argument. The appearance on the scene of a new person laying claim to the inheritance was undeniably, to any logical mind, the appearance on the scene of a criminal who herself brought with her the proofs of her crimes. Don Luis felt this clearly, and from that moment did not take his eyes off the Prefect of Police. Florence looked at them by turns as though the whole thing was the most insoluble mystery to her. Her beautiful dark eyes retained their customary serenity. She no longer wore her nurse's uniform, and her gray gown, very simply cut and devoid of ornaments, showed her graceful figure. She was grave and unemotional as usual. M. Desmalions said: "Explain yourself, mademoiselle." She answered: "I have nothing to explain, Monsieur le Préfet. I have come to you on an errand which I am fulfilling without knowing exactly what it is about." "What do you mean, without knowing what it is about?" "I will tell you, Monsieur le Préfet. Someone in whom I have every confidence and for whom I entertain the greatest respect asked me to hand you certain papers. They appear to concern the question which is the object of your meeting to day." "The question of awarding the Mornington inheritance?" "Yes." "You know that if this claim had not been made in the course of the present sitting, it would have had no effect?" "I came as soon as the papers were handed to me." "Why were they not handed to you an hour or two earlier?" "I was not there. I had to leave the house where I am staying in a hurry." Perenna did not doubt that it was his intervention that upset the enemy's plans by causing Florence to take to flight. The Prefect continued: "So you are ignorant of the reasons why you received the papers?" "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet." "And evidently you are also ignorant of how far they concern you." "They do not concern me, Monsieur le Préfet." M. Desmalions smiled and, looking into Florence's eyes, said plainly: "According to the letter that accompanies them, they concern you intimately. It seems that they prove, in the most positive manner, that you are descended from the Roussel family and that you consequently have every right to the Mornington inheritance." "I?" The cry was a spontaneous exclamation of astonishment and protest; and she at once went on insistently: "I a right to the inheritance? I have none at all, Monsieur le Préfet, none at all. I never knew Mr. Mornington. What is this story? There is some mistake." She spoke with great animation and with an apparent frankness that would have impressed any other man than the Prefect of Police. But how could he forget Don Luis's arguments and the accusation made beforehand against the person who would arrive at the meeting? "Give me the papers," he said. She took from her handbag a blue envelope which was not fastened down and which he found to contain a number of faded documents, damaged at the folds and torn in different places. He examined them amid perfect silence, read them through, studied them thoroughly, inspected the signatures and the seals through a magnifying glass, and said: "They bear every sign of being genuine. The seals are official." "Then, Monsieur le Préfet," said Florence in a trembling voice, "then, mademoiselle, let me tell you that your ignorance strikes me as most incredible." And turning to the solicitor, he said: "Listen briefly to what these documents contain and prove. Gaston Sauverand, Cosmo Mornington's heir in the fourth line, had, as you know, an elder brother, called Raoul, who lived in the Argentine Republic. This brother, before his death, sent to Europe, in the charge of an old nurse, a child of 5 who was none other than his daughter, a natural but legally recognized daughter whom he had had by Mademoiselle Levasseur, a French teacher at Buenos Aires. Here is the birth certificate. Here is the signed declaration written entirely in the father's hand. Here is the affidavit signed by the old nurse. Here are the depositions of 3 friends, merchants or solicitors at Buenos Aires. And here are the death certificates of the father and mother. All these documents have been legalized and bear the seals of the French consulate. For the present, I have no reason to doubt them, and I am bound to look upon Florence Levasseur as Raoul Sauverand's daughter and Gaston Sauverand's niece." "Gaston Sauverand's niece? His niece?" stammered Florence. The mention of a father whom she had, so to speak, never known, left her unmoved; but she began to weep at the recollection of Gaston Sauverand, whom she loved so fondly and to whom she found herself linked by such a close relationship. Were her tears sincere, or were they the tears of an actress able to play her part down to the slightest details? Were those facts really revealed to her for the first time, or was she acting the emotions which the revelation of those facts would produce in her under normal conditions? Don Luis observed M. Desmalions even more narrowly than he did the girl, and tried to read the secret thoughts of the man with whom the decision lay. And suddenly he became certain that Florence's arrest was a matter resolved upon as definitely as the arrest of the most monstrous criminal. Then he went up to her and said: "Florence." She looked at him with her tear-dimmed eyes and made no reply. Slowly he said: "To defend yourself, Florence."
For though I am sure you do not know it, you are under that obligation. You must understand the terrible position in which events have placed you. Florence, the Prefect of Police has been led by the logical outcome of those events to come to the final conclusion that the person entering this room with an evident claim to the inheritance is the person who killed the Mornington heirs. You entered the room, Florence, and you are undoubtedly Cosmo Mornington's heir." He saw her shake from head to foot and turn as pale as death. Nevertheless, she uttered no word and made no gesture of protest. He went on: "It is a formal accusation. Do you say nothing in reply?" She waited some time and then declared: "I have nothing to say. The whole thing is a mystery. What would you have me reply? I do not understand." Don Luis stood quivering with anguish in front of her. He stammered: "Is that all? Do you accept?" After a second, she said, in an undertone: "Explain yourself, I beg of you. What you mean, I suppose, is that, if I do not reply, I accept the accusation?" "Yes." "And then?" "Arrest, prison." "Prison!" She seemed to be suffering hideously. Her beautiful features were distorted with fear. To her mind, prison evidently represented the torments undergone by Marie and Sauverand. It must mean despair, shame, death, all those horrors which Marie and Sauverand had been unable to avoid and of which she in her turn would become the victim. An awful sense of hopelessness overcame her, and she moaned: "How tired I am! I feel that there is nothing to be done. I am stifled by the mystery around me. Oh, if I could only see and understand!" There was another long pause. Leaning over her, M. Desmalions studied her face with concentrated attention. Then, as she did not speak, he put his hand to the bell on his table and struck it 3 times. Don Luis did not stir from where he stood, with his eyes despairingly fixed on Florence. A battle was raging within him between his love and generosity, which led him to believe the girl, and his reason, which obliged him to suspect her. Was she innocent or guilty? He did not know. Everything was against her, and yet why had he never ceased to love her? Weber entered, followed by his men. M. Desmalions spoke to him and pointed to Florence. Weber went up to her. "Florence," said Don Luis. She looked at him and looked at Weber and his men, and suddenly realizing what was coming, she retreated, staggered for a moment, bewildered and fainting, and fell back in Don Luis's arms. "Oh, save me, save me, do save me!" The act was so natural and unconstrained, the cry of distress so clearly denoted the alarm which only the innocent can feel, that Don Luis was promptly convinced. A fervent belief in her lightened his heart. His doubts, his caution, his hesitation, his anguish, all these vanished before a certainty that dashed upon him like an irresistible wave, and he cried: "No, no, that must not be! Monsieur le Préfet, there are things that cannot be permitted!" He stooped over Florence, whom he was holding so firmly in his arms that nobody could have taken her from him. Their eyes met. His face was close to the girl's. He quivered with emotion at feeling her throbbing, so weak, so utterly helpless. And he said to her passionately, in a voice too low for any but her to hear: "I love you. I love you. Oh, Florence, if you only knew what I feel, how I suffer and how happy I am! Oh, Florence, I love you. I love you." Weber had stood aside, at a sign from the Prefect, who wanted to witness the unexpected conflict between those two mysterious beings, Don Luis Perenna and Florence Levasseur. Don Luis unloosed his arms and placed the girl in a chair. Then, putting his 2 hands on her shoulders, face to face with her, he said: "Though you do not understand, Florence, I am beginning to understand a good deal, and I can already almost see my way in the mystery that terrifies you. Florence, listen to me. It is not you who are doing all this, is it? There is somebody else behind you, above you, somebody who gives you your instructions, isn't there, while you yourself don't know where he is leading you?" "Nobody is instructing me. What do you mean? Explain." "Yes, you are not alone in your life. There are many things which you do because you are told to do them, and because you think them right, and because you do not know their consequences, or even that they can have any consequences. Answer my question: are you absolutely free? Are you not yielding to some influence?" The girl seemed to have come to herself, and her face recovered some of its usual calmness. Nevertheless, it seemed as if Don Luis's question made an impression on her. "No," she said, "there is no influence, none at all, I'm sure of it." He insisted, with growing eagerness: "No, you are not sure. Don't say that. Some one is dominating you without your knowing it. Think for a moment. You are Cosmo Mornington's heir to a fortune which you don't care about. I know, I swear. Well, if you don't want that fortune, to whom will it belong? Answer me.
Is there any one who is interested or believes himself interested in seeing you rich? The whole question lies in that. Is your life linked with that of some one else? Is he a friend of yours? Are you engaged to him?" She gave a start of revolt. "Oh, never! The man of whom you speak is incapable." "Ah!" he cried, overcome with jealousy. "You confess it! So the man of whom I speak exists! I swear that the villain—" He turned toward M. Desmalions, his face convulsed with hatred. He made no further effort to contain himself. "Monsieur le Préfet, we are in sight of the goal. I know the road that will lead us to it. The wild beast shall be hunted down to night, or to morrow at least. Monsieur le Préfet, the letter that accompanied those documents, the unsigned letter which this young lady handed to you, was written by the Mother Superior who manages a nursing home in the Avenue des Ternes. By making immediate inquiries at that nursing home, by questioning the superior and confronting her with Mlle. Levasseur, we shall discover the identity of the criminal himself. But we must not lose a minute, or we shall be too late and the wild beast will have fled." His outburst was irresistible. There was no fighting against the violence of his conviction. Still, M. Desmalions objected. "Mlle. Levasseur could tell us—" "She will not speak, or at least not till later, when the man has been unmasked in her presence. Monsieur le Préfet, I entreat you to have the same confidence in me as before. Have not all my promises been fulfilled? Have confidence, Monsieur le Préfet. Cast aside your doubts. Remember how Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand were overwhelmed with charges, the most serious charges, and how they succumbed in spite of their innocence. Does the law wish to see Florence Levasseur sacrificed as the two others were? And besides, what I ask for is not her release, but the means to defend her, that is to say, an hour or two's delay. Let Deputy Chief Weber be responsible for her safe custody. Let your detectives go with us. These and more as well, for we cannot have too many to capture the loathsome brute in his lair." M. Desmalions did not reply. After a brief moment he took Weber aside and talked to him for some minutes. M. Desmalions did not seem very favourably disposed toward Don Luis's request. But Weber was heard to say: "You need have no fear, Monsieur le Préfet. We run no risk." And M. Desmalions yielded. A few moments later, Don Luis Perenna and Florence Levasseur took their seats in a motor car with Weber and two inspectors. Another car, filled with detectives, followed. The hospital was literally invested by the police force, and Weber neglected none of the precautions of a regular siege. The Prefect of Police, who arrived in his own car, was shown by the manservant into the waiting room and then into the parlour, where the Mother Superior came to him at once. Without delay or preamble of any sort, he put his questions to her, in the presence of Don Luis, Weber, and Florence. "Reverend Mother," he said, "I have a letter here which was brought to me at headquarters and which tells me of the existence of certain documents concerning a legacy. According to my information, this letter, which is unsigned and which is in a disguised hand, was written by you. Is that so?" The Mother Superior, a woman with a powerful face and a determined air, replied without embarrassment: "That is so, Monsieur le Préfet. As I had the honour to tell you in my letter, I would have preferred, for obvious reasons, that my name should not be mentioned. Besides, the delivery of the documents was all that mattered. However, since you know that I am the writer, I am prepared to answer your questions." M. Desmalions continued, with a glance at Florence: "I will first ask you, Reverend Mother, if you know this young lady?" "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. Florence was with us for 6 months as a nurse, a few years ago. She gave such satisfaction that I was glad to take her back this day fortnight. As I had read her story in the papers, I simply asked her to change her name. We had a new staff at the hospital, and it was therefore a safe refuge for her." "But, as you have read the papers, you must be aware of the accusations against her." "Those accusations have no weight, Monsieur le Préfet, with any one who knows Florence. She has one of the noblest characters and one of the strictest consciences that I have ever met with." Chapter 17.